The air was heavy and cold. It smelled faintly of damp earth from the fields hugging the highway. This smell still makes my chest tight. My friend Jake and I were newly minted college graduates, driven by the dizzying idea of a grocery startup. And this roadside shop, Jake's dad's a 2Z general store, was our classroom. It was Thursday night, and Jake's dad was out of town, leaving us to handle the closing shift. The shop was a single exposed spot of fluorescent light on the dark road. Jake was leaning on the counter, calmly lining up gum packets. He mentioned we had 2 hours left. I, trying to sound cheerful despite my nerves, corrected him. 2 hours of market research. The next hour and a half moved with the slow, predictable rhythm of a rural store. Jake handled the farmer needing engine oil, and the truck driver grabbing a soda with easy professional patience. Then around 10:30 p.m., a man on a beat-up bike pulled up. He wore a light denim jacket, his face hidden by a worn cap. He stormed in, threw a few notes on the counter, and demanded cigarettes. Jake smoothly handed him the pack. The man pocketed them and demanded a lighter. Jake, genuinely apologetic, said they were completely out, but offered a box of matchsticks from under the counter as the only option. The man's pale face hardened. His eyes narrowed, moving from the matchsticks to Jake and then right through me. A sickening wave of panic hit my stomach. His voice dropped, suddenly sharp, asking if we were making fun of him, offering him sticks in front of a friend. We were stunned. I quickly intervened, my voice a little higher than normal, desperately assuring the man that we were not mocking him at all, and explaining that we had genuinely run out of stock due to a busy week and that matchsticks were the best we could do right now. Jake remained planted, ready to stand his ground, but I was already backing away mentally. A blinding, unreasonable fury took over the man. He launched into a loud, echoing argument about the insult. His voice bounced off the empty shelves, drumming doom in my chest. We tried to explain it was just a stock issue, but he refused to listen. Finally, he spun around, slammed the door, and stomped back to his bike. The engine roared, and he sped away, leaving a bitter silence. My hands were shaking as I muttered my shot. Jake just shook his head and replied, "That man was crazy." He glanced at the clock, 10:46 p.m. Only 14 minutes left, but the tense argument had completely shattered my calm. Jake, sensing the atmosphere, suggested they forget it and just shut up now. Jake yanked the heavy metal shutter down. The clang sealed us in. I felt trapped, not safe. I began stacking empty soda crates at the back while Jake headed for the main lights. That's when I smelled it, a faint, sickening mix of sulfur and gasoline. I called out to Jake, my voice laced with sudden fear, asking if he caught the smell. He stopped sniffing and concluded it smelled like smoke. We both stared at the bottom of the shutter. A tendril of thick, acrid smoke was snaking out from underneath. Jake dashed for the circuit board, but I screamed that the problem was outside and tore for the front door. My heart hammering, I ripped the door open and saw it instantly. Flames were greedily licking up the heavy metal, fed by a puddle of liquid splashed across the ground. I shouted a panicked warning of fire to Jake. I felt paralyzed. Jake burst out, already carrying the shop's bright red fire extinguisher. We aimed and covered the base of the shutter with white chemical foam, choking the fire until it died. In the sudden cold silence, we scanned the darkness. Nothing but open fields and the black highway. But then about a kilometer down the road, near a small clump of trees, I saw a familiar flash of metal. A bike. I pointed, barely able to speak. I was terrified, imagining the man coming back. Jake's face was pale, but his shock was instantly replaced by rage. He didn't hesitate. He ran back inside, ignored the phone, and reappeared clutching his father's licensed handgun. "We are not letting him get away with this," he growled, jaw tight. I wanted to hide and call the police from inside, but Jake was already running. I followed, my legs heavy with fear, sprinting toward the distant bike. As we closed the distance, Jake raised the pistol and fired one loud, deafening warning shot into the air. Suddenly, the denim-jacketed figure, the man, scrambled from behind the trees. He threw his leg over the bike, kicked the engine to life, and roared onto the highway. The bike was weaving wildly as he vanished into the night. We called the police immediately and told everything. The fight, the man trying to burn the store, how he got away, and about the single gunshot fired into the air as a warning. The police arrived 15 frantic minutes later. As we were describing the terrifying events to the lead officer, his partner's satellite phone buzzed. He listened intently, his expression shifting from focused concern to grim neutrality. He lowered the phone and looked straight at us, quietly sharing an update. About 5 kilometers from here, there had been a fatal traffic accident. He stated that a man, around 40 or 45, hit a truck and died instantly on the highway. He paused, his eyes sweeping over the singed shutter and the raw fear on my face, before concluding that the man was wearing a dark denim jacket. The silence that followed was heavier than the metal shutter. I didn't feel relief, only a horrifying sense that Jake's desperate bravery had somehow sealed the man's fate. I was still freshly graduated and working my first real job in the city. Some coworkers invited me to go for drinks with them on a Friday night to celebrate my first month on the team. I had an amazing time, and it was awesome to get to know them in such a casual and different environment. However, since I was only 19, I stuck to soda while everyone else went through rounds of cocktails. As the night wound down, a heavy knot formed in my stomach. My coworkers had insisted I treat them to a round of appetizers to celebrate my first paycheck. Between that and the looming deadline for my house rent, my bank account was terrifyingly low. I checked my banking app. The balance was barely enough to cover my rent, let alone a surge. Priced Uber across the city. By the time things wrapped up, I started calling around to some friends and family to see who was free to give me a ride home. I found out everyone with a car was either drunk, asleep, or both. I realized that if I was going to get home that night, I either had to hitch a ride with a total stranger or walk a heck of a long way on my own in the dark. As I couldn't afford a professional ride and I couldn't afford to lose my apartment. But the idea of the first thing scared the ever-living hell out of me. So I chose the second thing and started walking. I cannot overstate how glad I was that I chose to wear sneakers that night. The city streets were eerily quiet. About 20 minutes into the trek, a car slowed down beside me. The driver was a young man, clutching a roll of blueprints. He looked barely older than me, maybe 20. He looked harmless, almost stressed to the point of tears. "Please," he said, "I'm looking for the municipal planning office. I have a deadline, and I'm lost." I stepped closer to the curb to point the way. But as I did, the back door flew open. A woman leapt out from the back. She was well built, maybe 45 years old, and stood a towering 5'10". She had the look of a heavy drug user with deep, dark circles that made her look like a ghost. As I tried to back away, the woman lunged at me and we crashed into each other. I didn't just run, I fought back. She swung a heavy hand at my head and I ducked. I shoved my palms into her chest to create distance. She hissed at me, grabbing a handful of my hair, and for a terrifying moment we were locked in a struggle. Realizing I couldn't outfight her, I turned and bolted toward the side of the road. There was a heavy iron window grill attached to the front of a closed basement-level shop. I dived for it, wrapping my arms through the cold metal bars and locking my fingers together in a death grip. I knew that if they couldn't pull me off, they couldn't get me into the car. The driver then hopped out of the front to help his mother, and I realized then how small he was. He was a dwarf man who looked to be only 5 feet in height. He grabbed my waist and started pulling with everything he had.
"I want her,"
he demanded, his voice high-pitched and eerie.
"Mother, I want her."
The woman joined him, her large, rough hands wrapping around my wrists, trying to pry my fingers off the iron. I screamed until my throat felt like it was bleeding, kicking backward at anyone who touched me. The woman slammed her shoulder into me to try and knock the wind out of me, but I only squeezed the metal bars tighter, the iron digging painfully into my chest. Just as my strength began to fail, a tall black man appeared from the shadows of a nearby park entrance. He didn't hesitate. He shouted at the top of his lungs, charging toward the car. He had a heavy flashlight in his hand. As he ran, his voice boomed with a protective authority that seemed to shake the pavement, making it clear he wasn't just a witness, but a guardian. The sight of him coming for help broke their resolve. The woman let go of me, first cursing under her breath, her dark circled eyes snapping toward the newcomer. The young man let out a frustrated cry, but realized they were outmatched. They scrambled back into the car, the tires screeching as they sped away into the night. The man reached me seconds later, checking to see if I was hurt. I was shaking so hard I could barely stand, but I was safe. He stayed with me, calling the police and waiting until the patrol car arrived to ensure I got home. The man spoke in a soft voice to keep me calm. He told me his name was Marcus, and he lived nearby. He gave me his jacket because I was shivering from the cold and the fear. The police arrived quickly with their bright flashing lights. I told them everything that happened while Marcus stood by my side. They took notes and searched the area for the car. I felt a huge wave of relief wash over me. I realized how lucky I was that Marcus had been there. That night changed my whole life. I never walk alone anymore. I still think about that night, and how a pair of sneakers and that iron grill were the only things that stood between me and a nightmare. It was a light, rainy night, the kind where tiny drops just drift down from the sky like the air's quietly weeping. I was out delivering pasta on my motorbike, working for this little Italian joint on the edge of town. It was close to midnight, and the streets were empty except for the occasional passing car. I had one last order to drop off some fettuccine and garlic bread. The route took me to the edge of a neighborhood I'd never been to before. Not even a real neighborhood, honestly. More like a stretch of fancy-looking houses sitting in a row at the far end of a long road, one that seemed to just dead end into the dark. I rode slowly, rain dotting my glasses, tires whispering over wet asphalt. The air smelled damp and earthy, like freshly disturbed soil and pine. None of the houses had any lights on. They looked clean and well kept, not broken or falling apart, but every single one of them felt hollow. The houses were far apart. Between them, the wild bushes and tall, messy hedges looked dark and thick against the faint light. It felt like a real forest was waiting right behind their neat yards. I double-checked the address on my phone. It led me to what looked like an abandoned house. Not wrecked, but too quiet. No porch light, no car in the driveway, and no sound. I got off my motorbike, set the delivery bag over my shoulder, and walked up to the door. The driveway pavement was cracked and moss was growing through the gaps. I knocked. Nothing. No footsteps. No voice. Not even a shuffle from inside. I waited for a few seconds before hearing something. A soft honk. Just one. I turned my head toward the sound. A car was parked a little further down, near the edge of the empty lot next to the house. That lot wasn't empty. It was just a wall of dark, tangled woods. I hadn't noticed the car earlier. Its wipers were moving slowly, brushing away the mist. Inside, I could just barely make out a man with a thick beard sitting behind the wheel. He didn't get out, just raised his hand and made a small motion. He was telling me to come over. I stood there, confused. The house was empty. The guy in the car was watching me. The street behind me was dark and silent. The only sound was the distant, unsettling hum of the nearby woods and the soft patter of the rain. Something about it didn't sit right. I backed off the porch slowly, the pasta still warm in my hand. My eyes flicked from the car to the house, back to the man. He hadn't moved. The only thing alive in that moment were the windshield wipers dragging back and forth like clock hands ticking down to something. He again gave a sign to come. Now he must have said something, which I did not hear, but saw his moving lips. I stood frozen, unsure. I went close. I saw him before he could open the door. He was in t-shirt, but with only briefs. The pasta was fallen, and for a long second, neither of us moved. The man didn't say anything. He just stared at me, blinking slowly behind the glass. like he couldn't believe I'd actually walked up. Something about his eyes. It wasn't rage or threat, but hunger mixed with hesitation. I looked down at the pavement. My feet were on the edge of the puddle, and the rain had soaked through my socks. He tapped the window. Once, then again, this time faster. I flinched. The way he tapped, it was like he was trying to wake me up. I could see a takeout container on the passenger seat next to him, already opened. Fork still inside. He hadn't been waiting for food. He was waiting for something else. He leaned forward and mouthed something again. Something I didn't catch, but he looked irritated now. Like I was the one wasting his time. Like I was supposed to understand. The motor in my head finally turned over. I shook my head and stepped back. And when I did, his whole body stiffened, like I'd ruined whatever plan he had. His fingers tightened around the wheel. His face dropped out of sight for a moment like he was bending forward. That was it. That was all I needed to see. I turned and ran, got on my motorbike and rode. Fast. I didn't stop until I was at the main road again, back under streetlights and around other people. Later, I told my manager what happened. He pulled up the order details, and turns out the number and name were fake, just like that address. The timestamp on the last order read exactly 9:25 p.m. And according to him, mine wasn't the first weird delivery in that area. Someone had been placing fake orders, then waiting around in parked cars. It's always at the road's end, right where the trees start, watching, signaling. I don't know what the guy wanted, but whatever it was, I wasn't going to be the one to find out. I was 19, and for the first time, my parents had left me alone for a full weekend in our suburban home. Most people my age would throw a party, but I had a different plan. It was New Year's Eve, and while the rest of the neighborhood was out at countdown parties, whereas I'd promised my followers a special midnight seafood feast mukbang to ring in the new year, the day started with a weird ping. Around 2 p.m., while I was prepping 3 pounds of king crab and spicy noodles, my friend Leo, who lives directly across the street, sent me a DM. "Yo, who's the guy in the reflective vest in your driveway? Utility worker?" I wiped my hands and checked the front window. The street was dead silent. The gray winter sky casting long, cold shadows over the patches of melting snow. No trucks, no vests. I told Leo he was seeing things. He didn't drop it, though. He insisted he saw a guy leaning over, trying to peer through the gap in our dining room curtains. I laughed it off, as Leo being a bored troll, and got back to my setup. By 9 p.m., I was live. I had the ring light blinding me, the high-gain microphone ready to catch every crunch, and a massive spread of food. Outside, I could hear the occasional distant pop of a firework, but inside the house felt eerily insulated. I was an hour into the stream, chatting with my viewers and tearing into a crab leg, when the chat started moving too fast to read. User 99, look at the kitchen doorway. Hungry Ghost, is that a prank? Lol, who is that? Spice King, dude, someone is behind you. I froze, a noodle halfway to my mouth. I turned around, but the kitchen was a sea of shadows behind my bright filming lights. I couldn't see anything. Very funny, guys, I said to the camera, forced a laugh and kept eating, but my heart was hammering against my ribs. I decided to take a bathroom break just to check the house. I left the camera running. It's better for the algorithm anyway. I walked through the downstairs, flicking on every single light. The house felt heavy, like the air had grown thick. I checked the side window in the laundry room. It was locked, but the glass felt ice cold against my palm. I went back to the stream, trying to regain my rhythm. I was finishing the last of the noodles when I noticed something chilling. My headphones were high fidelity. They picked up everything. As I chewed, I heard a faint rhythmic thump creak coming from the stairs behind me. I stopped chewing. The sound stopped. I took a deliberate, loud bite of a rice cake. Crunch. A split second later, a soft clack echoed from the floorboards in the hallway. They were mimicking me. Every time I made a sound for the stream, they moved, using my own noise to mask their footsteps. I didn't look back. I didn't want the person to know I knew. I looked at the chat, which was now a blur of call the police and run. I grabbed my phone, typed a quick text to Leo. Call 911. Someone is in the house. Don't call me. I stayed in front of the camera pretending to read comments, my hands shaking so hard I had to hide them under the table. I picked up a piece of food, but my throat felt tight and dry. I tried to smile for the camera, but my face felt like a mask. Every time I made a loud noise, I listened for a sound in the dark kitchen. I started talking faster and louder just to drown out the silence of the house. I felt like an animal in a cage with a bright light shining on me. I knew that if I stopped talking, the person behind me might move closer. I watched the chat messages fly past. Everyone was telling me to run, but my legs felt like lead. I was trapped in my own chair, waiting for a hand to touch my shoulder. In the distance, I heard a chorus of car horns and cheers. Midnight had hit, and the world was celebrating while I sat frozen. Suddenly, Leo's name popped up in a private message. I see him. He just jumped out your pantry window. He's heading for the woods behind the fence. Cops are 2 minutes out. I bolted. I didn't stop until I was out the front door and standing in the middle of the street in the freezing January air, surrounded by the smell of spent fireworks. The police found the side window had been jimmied open with a screwdriver. They also found a series of slushy, melting footprints that led from the kitchen, stayed exactly 6 feet behind my streaming chair, and followed me halfway up the stairs before retreating. The creepiest part wasn't just that he was in there. It was that when the police reviewed my stream archive, they saw him, in the dark background. A pale face had emerged from the shadows of the hallway 3 different times. He wasn't there to rob me. He was just watching me eat. He's still out there. Every New Year's Eve, I stay in a hotel. Every time I hear someone chew too loudly, I find myself looking for the shadow in the doorway. There is a quiet, hidden lake a short walk from my house in East Texas. I've been going there to fish for a long time. It is tucked away from the roads and houses, which gives it perfect privacy. Usually, I am the only person out there on the water. Because the walk is a bit long, I leave my canoe in the same spot by the lake whenever I am not using it. It is much easier than carrying the heavy thing back and forth from the house. I keep it leaning against a large oak tree and keep it covered so that snakes or other animals do not hide inside. One warm summer evening, I was out on the water with my younger brother, MJ. He is only in the 4th grade, and since our parents were out for the evening, I was responsible for watching him. We had been out for about an hour and had caught a few catfish. As the sun began to set and the light disappeared behind the pine trees, I heard a loud splashing sound from the edge of the lake. I turned the boat and saw a man standing at the water's edge. He was tipping a large barrel over and pouring a dark liquid into the lake. It looked like he was polluting the water. I felt I had to do something, so I shouted out to ask him what he was doing. The man looked up at me in surprise and immediately ran into the woods, even though the barrel was still pouring. I looked closer at the liquid and noticed it was a very dark red color. Even though it was getting dark, the sight made me feel very uneasy. I decided we needed to leave right away. I care a lot about nature, and seeing someone dump waste like that made me sick, but I no longer felt safe at the lake. I planned on reporting the man to the authorities. I paddled back to our usual spot and unloaded our gear. As I was covering the canoe, I heard the distinct sound of a branch snapping nearby. I wanted to call out, but I decided it was better to stay quiet. I finished my work faster than ever before. I did not even bother to lean the canoe against the tree. I just left it on the grass. I grabbed our cooler and gear and MJ and I walked quickly. I kept looking over my shoulder the entire time because I felt like someone was following us through the trees. Once we got home, I locked the door immediately. I was truly spooked. I put the fish in the fridge and started heating up some food for my brother. While the microwave was running, There was a sudden knock at the front door. The fear I felt in the woods came back instantly. I was certain I had been followed. My lights were on and my car was in the driveway, so whoever was outside knew we were home. A moment later, the person moved and knocked on the window. A man's voice came through the glass, telling me that he had seen me at the lake and wanted to explain himself. I had no intention of opening the door. The fact that he had tracked me to my house made him seem very dangerous. When he became more aggressive and kept yelling for me to answer, I finally shouted through the wall. I told him to leave immediately or I would call the police. The man tried to remain calm and asked me again to just open the front door so he could talk. I repeated my threat to call the cops, and then the house went silent. I went around and locked every single window. I called the police to report the dumping at the lake and the man at my door. Making those reports helped me feel a little better, but I remained very alert. Around 2 a.m., a loud crash from the den woke me up. I realized someone had broken in. I grabbed a heavy baseball bat and told MJ to stay hidden. I heard quiet footsteps coming up the stairs. I stood by the bedroom door with the bat ready. I watched the doorknob slowly turn and the door push open. The silhouette of a man entered the room. I quickly turned on the lamp and yelled for him to get out. I showed him I was armed and ready to defend us. The man had a small blade in his hand, but when he saw I wasn't backing down, he told me he was leaving. He turned and ran back downstairs. I chased him as far as the landing and watched him flee through the front door. I checked on MJ and then called the emergency line. My living room window was completely shattered with glass all over the carpet. I stayed awake for the rest of the night, holding my bat and watching that broken window. At 7 a.m., my parents finally returned home. I explained everything that had happened while they were away. My father went straight to work. He measured the frame and fixed the window. I later went back to the lake with the police to show them where the man had been. However, the barrel was gone. The man must have come back to move it before morning. I believe that barrel held something much worse than chemicals. I think it was something he was willing to kill for. I am just glad I kept the door locked and my brother safe. A week later, I still felt uneasy, so I went back to the oak tree to get my canoe. The grass underneath it was flat and dying. When I flipped the boat over, I froze in fear. Someone had carved a message into the wood with a knife. I know where you sleep. Next to the words was a rusty fishing lure I had never seen before. That's when it hit me. He hadn't just followed me once. He was still out there watching and waiting for me to be alone in the woods again. This is a situation currently unfolding in my life. It has been persisting for nearly 3 weeks now. I recently decided to create a profile on the dating website Plenty of Fish. I had been single for 8 months and knew several friends who had found success on the platform. I figured there was no harm in trying it out for myself. About a month after I signed up, I received a message from a very attractive girl. We seemed to get along quite well and maintained a conversation for a few weeks. We eventually decided to exchange our Kik usernames. That was the moment everything took a turn for the worse. Within the span of only 4 messages, she admitted that her profile pictures were fake. She proceeded to send me new ones, promising me that she was being honest this time, and swearing that she was real. However, the girl in the new photos looked too good to be true, being a frequent viewer of the show Catfish. I decided to perform a reverse image search. My suspicions were confirmed when I found the identity of the real girl in the photos. When I confronted her with my findings, she sent another set of images. Once again, a quick search proved they were not her. At this point, I became completely fed up with the deception. I told her firmly to never contact me again. My rejection caused her to become extremely angry. She began hurling every possible insult at me, claiming that she was a stripper. She claimed she could have provided me with any pleasure I desired, and insisted that I was the one missing out. Shortly after, I started receiving messages from various new accounts. These accounts on Plenty of Fish and Kik all claimed to be her friends or colleagues. However, they all utilized the exact same typing style she did. Deep down, I knew with certainty that they were all just her using different aliases. I finally decided I had dealt with enough of her behavior. I signed out of Kik on my mobile device, deleted the application entirely, and attempted to move on with my day. However, my phone soon began buzzing with standard text messages. She had somehow obtained my personal number. She started sending a barrage of messages, claiming she was sorry, professing her love for me, and stating she desperately wanted me back. Eventually, a final message appeared that contained nothing but a web link. I examined the URL and noticed it ended with the phrase, "I love you." I chose not to open it. Feeling physically sick to my stomach from the stress, I tried to have dinner, but I could not bring myself to actually cook anything. Instead, I simply sat at my desk in the dark with a burger and a Coke. I switched on my laptop, hoping to find a good show to watch as a distraction. However, I felt so mentally drained that I ended up mindlessly scrolling through reels on YouTube. Suddenly, without any input from me, a new browser tab jerked open. The same link from the text message, the one ending in "I love you," loaded itself onto my screen. The entire window theme instantly shifted into a deep, unnatural shade of black. My heart skipped a beat as a pop-up window appeared. It was a live feed of my own face, captured from my webcam. Another pop-up window appeared right next to it. In that frame, I could see the dim silhouette of a woman sitting in a pitch-black room, silently watching me through the screen. I panicked and immediately tried to shut the laptop down, but the entire system had been locked. Even the physical power button on the hardware would not respond to my touch. I looked at the icons on my desktop with horror. Every one of my files, including my office work, my personal photos, and my private documents, was now hidden behind an encryption shield. A message flashed across the center of my screen. It informed me that my system was locked. It stated that to regain access to my work and personal files, I was required to share my bank details with the lady in the shadow. It further noted that a fee of $500 would be charged. It was in that moment that I realized this was not a simple case of catfishing. It was a targeted scam, originating from the dark web. I did not stick around to see what the silhouette would do next. I reached behind my desk and ripped the power cord for the Wi-Fi router out of the wall. Then, I flipped the laptop over and tore the battery straight out of the casing. The screen finally went dead. Thankfully, I had been cautious enough to keep a backup of almost all my important data on a separate portable hard drive. This device was not plugged into the computer at the time. I took the laptop to a professional service center the following morning. The technicians informed me that the entire operating system had been compromised and that they would have to reinstall Windows from scratch. They also issued a stern warning for me to change my network immediately, as my personal information was likely now floating around on a dark web hit list. I ended up losing my personal settings and quite a few nights of sleep, but I am proud to say I did not give that shadow a single cent of my money. The fluorescent lights of the office had been buzzing in my ears for 12 hours. My boss had been clear. The deadline was tomorrow, and being the new guy at 22, I wasn't about to be the one who failed. By the time I sprinted for the last bus, my off-green button-down was damp with sweat, and my tie was hanging loosely around my neck. I managed to collapse into a seat just as the doors hissed shut. The ride was a 75-minute blur of city lights and exhaustion. When the bus finally spat me out at my stop, I still had a 10-minute walk ahead of me. It was 9:20 p.m. In this neighborhood that wasn't late, but the streets were unnervingly empty. The silence felt heavy. The streetlights here are a joke. They're spaced so far apart that the sidewalk is a sequence of bright circles followed by long stretches of ink-black shadows. I hiked my laptop bag higher on my shoulder and quickened my pace. I was approaching the old abandoned hospital. I usually didn't mind it. I'd started hitting the gym recently and felt capable, even confident. Then I heard it. Clang, a sharp metallic strike against stone. I slowed down. Sitting on a large rock near the hospital's perimeter was a man. He looked like a ghost skeletal, skin stretched so tight over his ribs you could count them through his tattered open shirt. Clang. He hit the stone again. This time I saw the glint. It was a 9-inch blade, shimmering under the distant yellow glow of a street lamp. He muttered something, a guttural, unintelligible scream. Then, he began to tap the flat of the blade against his palm. The sound was a wet thud that echoed off the hospital walls. I tried to stay calm, but his head tilted to the side as he watched me. He looked like he was hunting. I gripped my bag tighter, wondering if I could use it to protect myself. My heart was beating so fast I could feel it in my throat. I kept my eyes forward and kept walking. I tried to look strong, even though I was terrified. Every step felt heavy. I was almost past him and back into the dark part of the street when I heard his feet move on the gravel. He didn't move slowly. He jumped toward me. Suddenly, the distance between us evaporated. He was fast. Before I could breathe, he was standing right in front of me. He smelled like old sweat and copper. It was a thick, gross smell that made me want to gag. He stepped into my path, his eyes wide and glazed with a drug-induced film. His pupils were huge and gray. He reached out and grabbed my hand, holding me in place. His grip was very strong. His skin felt cold and dry, like old leather. But he didn't point the blade at me. Instead, he turned the knife toward his own chest. He leaned in until his face was only inches from mine. I could see the cracks on his lips and his yellow teeth. He didn't blink once. He looked very calm as he pushed the sharp edge of the knife into his own skin. He began to cut himself slowly. The blade went through his skin easily, like it was cutting through paper. I heard a quiet, wet sound as the skin opened up. I stood frozen and watched the blood start to cover his chest. The first few drops were dark, but then they turned bright red. He didn't seem to feel any pain. He didn't even make a sound. Actually, he looked more relaxed as he did it. He used the tip of the knife to draw a bloody line across his collarbone. The sight was traumatizing. I wanted to run or scream, but I couldn't move. A drop of his blood landed on my shirt sleeve. It felt warm on my arm. As the blood became more visible, his smile only grew wider, stretching across his face in a way that didn't feel human. His smile was so wide it looked like his skin might rip. He leaned his forehead against mine and forced me to look down at his bloody chest. He wasn't trying to rob me. He was showing me something horrific. "Do you see?" he whispered. His voice was rough and dry. "Do you see how easy it is?" He started to laugh. It was a low, bubbling sound. Blood was everywhere now. It soaked into his pants and dripped onto the ground between us. He started to sway back and forth, pulling me with him because he still had hold of my hand. He kept moving the knife, making small, quick cuts over his ribs. He finally released my hand, and the sheer shock of what I had just witnessed made my knees buckle. I fell onto the street in total terror. The ground was cold and dirty under my hands. He didn't move toward me. He simply started that same rhythmic tapping again, hitting the now blood-stained knife against his hand while staring into my soul. The sound of the metal hitting his bloody palm was the only thing I could hear. He looked happy, like he had just shown me something important. I looked at the knife, and then at his face. I realized the knife wasn't meant for me. It was for him. He just wanted me to watch his nightmare. He kept staring at me, and I saw spit dripping from the corner of his mouth. I didn't wait to see what he would do next. I threw my wallet toward him, though I don't think he even wanted it. It landed near his feet, but he didn't look at it. I scrambled to my feet, tripping over my feet once before I got steady. I ran. I didn't stop until I was through my front door, fumbling with the deadbolt. I leaned against the door and tried to breathe. My lungs felt like they were on fire. I looked down and saw the red blood stain on my sleeve. I took the shirt off immediately and threw it in the trash. I didn't want it near me. I never made a complaint to the police. I know who those people are, and they know me. Making a scene would only make it worse. In this part of town, the police can't really help with people like him. I'm already looking for a new place to rent. But for now, I make sure my work is done long before the deadline hits. I don't walk those streets in the dark anymore. Now, every time I hear metal hitting something like a spoon on a plate, I feel his cold hand on my wrist again. I can still see his dark eyes watching me from the shadows.
She was perfect. Raw potential wrapped in a deceptively sweet smile. When I first found Zuyang, drifting after dropping out of university, I saw it instantly. Not just her looks, but the way she ate. Mechanical, endless, yet paired with an innocent charm that drew people in. It was rare. The timing could not have been better. COVID arrived, people were trapped indoors, desperate for distraction, and suddenly watching others gorge themselves online became an obsession. Mukbang exploded, and she fit it perfectly. I convinced her that this was more than eating, that it was a performance, and that she had something special. I made her believe she could be adored, that money and fame were waiting. I told her I would guide her, shape her, and make her famous, as long as she trusted me. She did, and it worked. Subscribers flooded in, views multiplied. She became Korea's darling mukbanger, my darling. Built from nothing, shaped by my hand. But fame has a way of corrupting people. She started forgetting her place, thinking she was more than just a girl who eats on camera, thinking she had control. Sometimes discipline was necessary. Sometimes reminders were necessary. She needed to remember who was in charge. She bruised easily. She was sensitive. Always clumsy, especially around those grills she insisted on using. The fans noticed, of course. The charity donation, $144,000, was my idea. Good public relations, clean image. They saw an angel. They never saw the strings. When she started thinking about leaving, I reminded her of reality. I let her understand what would happen if certain private moments were exposed. I made sure she imagined the shame, her family, her fans, the collapse of everything she had. Fear bloomed exactly as expected. She stayed, she smiled, she obeyed. She needed structure, so I created it, an agency, my agency. I framed it as professionalism, contracts, management, protection from stress. I handled the deals. She focused on eating. A 70-30 split in my favor was fair. I built everything. She hesitated, but she signed. She always did in the end. The money poured in, $3 million. My rightful share earned. Then the parasites appeared, cyber wreckers, bottom feeders like Jay, Din, and Caracula, desperate to attach themselves to real success. Akura, an idiot and supposedly Jay's friend, got hold of a useless recording. Gossip about her past, hostess bar trash, a tax issue I was managing, a sponsorship deal I negotiated. They thought they could blackmail my asset. Amateurs. Jay and Din tried for a pathetic $7,000. I had already secured a proper management fee of $40,000. They didn't understand the game. Akura didn't bury it. He handed it to Pan, another wrecker trying to clean up his friend's involvement in the old Mariang 44 mess. Pan passed it to Kim, a self-righteous hypocrite chasing attention. Kim saw an opportunity and leaked everything. My business, my life. The narrative flipped overnight. The internet turned. Questions spread. Her past, the hostess bar, taxes. Suddenly, I was the villain. All because she couldn't keep her past buried, and vultures wanted their cut. Then she went live, July 11th. Tears, a carefully spun story. 4 years of abuse, she claimed. Sexual assault, extortion, illegal filming, financial exploitation. All lies. Discipline reframed as cruelty. Structure twisted into crimes. She tried to destroy me. The contract was fair. The recordings were necessary. The leverage was necessary. After everything I did for her, She turned on me. Then came the lawsuit. Claims of unpaid earnings and contract termination. Everything was written clearly, yet they ignored it. They played an audio clip. Sounds ripped from context. A slammed door, muffled screams, my voice distorted into something monstrous. They cornered me. Media. Public opinion. Her lawyers with their so-called evidence. Thousands of recordings. Thousands of photos. It didn't matter how they got them. The damage was done. My agency, my reputation, my money, all threatened. All because of her. She couldn't handle the life I gave her. Ungrateful. They wanted a monster. They pushed me into it. Fine. Let them pick through the wreckage. But they should know this was never my fault. It was always hers. She pushed me to this. They all did. My only regret? Maybe I should have controlled her better from the very beginning.
After the story ends, I want you to hear this from me. I know he tried to control the narrative and share his own version of events. For a long time, people only heard his side. Behind the camera, my manager, who was also my ex-boyfriend, controlled me. He took most of my earnings and used private recordings to keep me afraid. When I went live, it wasn't a breakdown. It was me telling the truth. With help, I released 3,800 files that exposed everything. This is where the story really ends, with the truth, and with me choosing myself.
Years ago, during my college days while working late shifts as a bartender, I found myself driving home on a divided highway at approximately 3 a.m. The roads were mostly empty, but the silence was shattered when I spotted a pair of headlights heading directly toward me in the wrong lane. My initial reaction was one of self-doubt. I assumed the vehicle must be on the other side of the concrete divider, and that my tired eyes were playing tricks on me. However, reality set in quickly as a white Ford sedan roared past me, traveling against the flow of traffic at roughly 90 miles per hour. Since I was also driving a white Ford sedan at the time, the coincidence struck me as odd, though I didn't have much time to dwell on it. I immediately pulled onto the shoulder to let the driver pass safely, and then decided to call the police to report the hazard before a fatal head-on collision could occur. I provided the dispatcher with my exact location and the nearest mile marker. She thanked me and confirmed that a state trooper would be dispatched to intercept the vehicle. Knowing that the state police barracks were located only a few exits ahead, I assumed the authorities would have the situation under control within minutes. I merged back onto the highway and continued my commute, feeling a sense of relief that I had done my civic duty. However, that relief was short-lived. A few miles down the road, I noticed a pair of headlights gaining on me rapidly. In rural southeastern Pennsylvania at that hour, the only vehicles on the road are typically long, haul truckers or patrolling police officers. As the car approached, I stayed in the right-hand lane to allow it to pass me. Instead of overtaking, the driver pulled right up to my rear bumper and switched on their high beams. The glare was blinding, reflecting off my mirrors and making it nearly impossible to see the road ahead. My first thought was that a police officer had spotted my car and, seeing a white Ford sedan, confused me with the wrong-way driver I had reported. Wanting to be prepared and cooperative, I reached into my glove box to retrieve my registration and insurance cards. Just as my hand touched the paperwork, the car behind me abruptly slammed on its brakes and came to a dead stop in the middle of the highway lanes. The driver then killed their lights entirely, vanishing into the darkness. A wave of panic washed over me. I realized with a sinking feeling that the car looked identical to the white sedan I had seen earlier. Furthermore, I was terrified that if it was an undercover cop, my sudden movement toward the glove box might have been perceived as reaching for a weapon. My heart racing, I called 911 a second time to ask if the vehicle behind me belonged to the trooper they had sent. The dispatcher sounded somewhat short with me, perhaps stressed by the night's events, and reiterated that a trooper was indeed on the way. I frantically explained that someone was following me and acting in an incredibly erratic manner. I told her I was worried I had inadvertently startled an officer by reaching for my registration. The dispatcher asked if I was currently pulled over. but I clarified that the vehicle behind me had never used any emergency lights or sirens. Hearing the tension in my voice, she told me she would try to contact the responding trooper via radio to verify their position. As we remained on the line, the car behind me suddenly accelerated, closing the gap until it was mere inches from my bumper, and then slammed on its brakes once more. The driver began laying on the horn in long, aggressive bursts while repeatedly flashing their high beams. I told the dispatcher that I was now certain this was not the police. She could hear the deafening horn and the chaotic sounds through the phone, and finally agreed that it likely wasn't the trooper. This realization was genuinely terrifying. Moments before, my biggest fear was getting a ticket or facing a misunderstanding with law enforcement, but now I realized I was being targeted by a potentially dangerous individual. I informed the dispatcher that I was going to speed up to create distance and that I would only pull over if I saw genuine police lights. Even as I accelerated well beyond the speed limit, the white sedan stayed glued to my bumper and began swerving violently from side to side. I tried to use a bit of trickery by signaling for an upcoming exit and slowing down as if to leave the highway, but when I jerked back onto the main road at the last second, the driver matched my move perfectly. I considered driving to a nearby Wawa, a well-lit convenience store, to find safety in numbers, but the dispatcher advised against it, fearing I might lead the aggressor into a crowded area or get trapped. Instead, her supervisor took over the call and instructed me to drive directly to the state police station, which was only one exit away. I pushed my car to its limit, speeding toward the station and blowing through red lights at the end of the off-ramp as the car behind me attempted to pull alongside or pass me, almost as if trying to force me off the road. The tension was at a breaking point until the police station finally came into view. As soon as I signaled my turn into the station's driveway, the other car reacted instantly. The driver slammed on their brakes, turned off their headlights, and disappeared into the shadows of a nearby shopping center parking lot. I pulled into the station lot and was met by 3 troopers who were already waiting outside with their flashlights drawn. 2 of them immediately jumped into their cruisers to search the area for the white sedan, while I stayed behind to catch my breath and give a formal statement. I sat in the station for a long time, recounting the details of the pursuit. Eventually, the 3rd trooper escorted me the rest of the way home to ensure I arrived safely. I never heard another word about the incident from the department. Because of that silence, I assumed the driver was never caught. Even now, I wonder what that person's intentions were, and how the night might have ended if the police station hadn't been so close.
The internet is a vast landscape where trends shift with incredible speed. It is often baffling how certain foolish behaviors become global sensations. Some of these trends are harmless, while others become life-threatening incidents that serve as a grim, cautionary tale. One of the most notorious examples is the tragedy of a deadly mukbang broadcast. Mukbang involves individuals consuming a massive variety and large quantity of food while recording the act. It is yet another weird phenomenon that captured the internet's attention. Tracy Leo is a 17-year-old girl who was deeply keen on starting a career as an influencer. She was constantly looking for any possible option to become an internet celebrity. Having just finished school, she decided to venture into digital fame. She tried many different content styles, but she failed at all of them. It was during this period of trial and error that she came across the mukbang community. When she started, she would introduce herself and announce it was eating time. Since it was a relatively new niche at the time, she decided to commit to it fully. She kicked off her new channel by attempting to eat the entire McDonald's menu in a single sitting. As she ate, she talked. Her mouth was so full that nobody could understand what she was saying. She mostly made muffled sounds while chewing. She worked her way through every drink and every meal on the menu. However, her body eventually gave out. In the middle of the broadcast, she puked everything up. Ironically, that specific instance of physical failure became her ticket to fame. It took about a month for the video to reach a wide audience, but once it did, it became a sensation. Her channel picked up views after views, and she began adapting her content to keep the momentum going. She started running polls to let her fans decide which menu she should tackle next. She invited people to request specific meals. Her channel was soon flooded with comments. Local diners and national chains began reaching out to sponsor her videos, and she accepted many of these deals.
She was earning a significant income from these sponsorships by the end of the year. She saved enough money to pay for her entire college education. However, the requests from her fans were becoming increasingly nasty and strange. Some people asked her to eat rare, dangerous plants, while others suggested live animals. Despite the weirdness, her growing view count turned her into a genuine mukbang phenomenon. Eventually, she received the deal of a lifetime. A diner known as Marble Heights offered her $100,000 to consume their entire signature menu. Tracy decided to live, stream the entire event on her channel to maximize the impact. Because her audience was now huge, she had approximately 30,000 people watching her from the very first second the stream went live. She began the challenge with a fresh batch of honey-dipped pancakes and then moved on to an egg, bacon and grilled cheese sandwich. These first two meals were incredibly heavy and took her nearly 10 minutes to finish. Despite the nature of her work, Tracy made sure she stayed in good physical shape. She was 18 years old and possessed a slim, fit body that seemed at odds with the amount of food she consumed. This physical contrast likely attracted more viewers as people were fascinated by someone who could enjoy so much greasy food while maintaining a perfect physique. After devouring the sandwiches, she moved on to a large bucket of chicken. Once that was finished, she brought out blueberry pastries and began chugging apple juice to wash them down. Almost immediately, a weird redness began to spread across her face, but she ignored it and kept going. She moved on to bacon and hamburgers, followed by frosted coffee with ice cream. She then ate a bowl of clam chowder and another plate of bacon-greased cheese sliders. She ended the mukbang by drinking a lime soda. This helped relieve the acid buildup in her chest. As her viewers commented on how amazing she was, the redness on her face intensified. One of the audience members happened to be a doctor, and he posted an urgent warning. He told her she was likely experiencing a heart attack and that she needed to call 911 immediately. Tracy saw the comment, but ignored the gravity of the situation. She joked that the menu definitely felt like a heart attack. She laughed and told her audience that she was a regular at the gym and wasn't like a typical unhealthy person who couldn't handle a big meal. However, in the middle of her sentence, she felt a heavy pressure. She moved her hand quickly to grab her phone and call an ambulance, but she collapsed face down into her plates of food before she could dial. The comment section went silent for a moment before people began to freak out. After a while, the live stream showed paramedics arriving at her home. They performed CPR on her, and the very first thing they did was reach over and close the camera lens. That was the first death witnessed live. In the aftermath, the Marble Heights meal became known as the Heart Attack Menu and became a viral challenge among other eaters. Ironically, no one else died from eating it. It was eventually revealed it wasn't a heart attack. It was a severe blueberry allergy she never knew she had. Today, the video of her final meal still exists in the dark corners of the internet. People watched the moment she ate those blueberry pastries, pointing at the screen when the redness first appeared. The empty plates and the spilled lime soda stay frozen in time on the recording. Fans leave comments of regret, wishing she had listened to the doctor instead of the cheers of the crowd. Her empty gym clothes and her college books remain untouched in her room. It is a sad reminder that chasing digital fame can sometimes cost more than anyone should ever pay.
Have any of you given that Bumble app a go? I know it seems massively counterintuitive to download an app which requires the girl to make the first move, when they're notoriously not the ones to make the first move. But I can assure you, it's definitely worth it. But at the same time, I think the single worst thing that happened to me in 2020 took place just as a result of a Bumble date. So it all started when I matched with a Welsh girl named Lima. After a day or two of talking, we agreed to meet at a little cafe for a few coffees. We hit it off talking about this and that, and before you know it, we were chatting like we'd known each other for years. 1 hour turned to 2, 2 to 3, and still neither of us was ready to call time on the date. Neither of us drank alcohol that evening. Her for religious reasons, me because I'm something of a fitness freak. But while she was drinking mocktails, I was on the coffee, and I was on it big time. There came a point where I needed a wee so badly because of my medical issues. The wait became an absolute nightmare. I was struggling to keep my composure while waiting for the one-person toilet to be free. This happened every half an hour without fail almost all night. I had to interrupt her, apologize, and leg it off to the little bathroom to relieve myself. I felt like an absolute idiot having to nip off to the lavs so often. But every time I emerged, she'd look up and smile, waving away my apologies with some light mockery of how I have the bladder of a 4-year-old. But one time, I emerged from the toilet to see that she was no longer sitting alone, and that someone was sitting in my seat. At first, I thought she'd just bumped into a guy she knew. She certainly looked quite comfortable talking to him, but it turned out to be the complete opposite. I walked up behind him and playfully put my hands on his shoulders. I told him in a joking way that he might be in my seat. It wasn't confrontational or aggressive, just pure banter. I expected the guy to jump up, maybe warmly apologize, maybe give a little introduction, something like that. But he didn't. He looked back at me with this look on his face that clearly signaled he wanted me to get my hands off him immediately. And as he was staring up at me, Lima shot me a look as if to ask for help. Only then did I realize the situation was not what I thought, and I asked if they actually knew each other. Turns out this bloke had been sitting alone enjoying some food and wine and had been making eyes at Lima every so often. Then, when I'd gone off for a wee, he'd taken his opportunity, sat in my seat, and then began to, as Lima put it, flirt so outrageously forward that she felt like she was going to be sick. Now, I actually had to ask this guy to leave us alone before he got up and finally gave me my chair back, but not before he tried to stare me out. I had a few inches on him, and I could tell he didn't put half the gym time in that I did, so it's not like I was in the least bit intimidated. It just seemed like he was trying really, really hard to be some comic book idea of what women want, and was honestly a little bit pathetic. He looked completely and utterly harmless, like a chocolate pistol. He looked like he'd melt at the first sign of trouble. But as I found out later that night, looks can be dangerously deceiving. So, after the little confrontation at the table, Lima and I laughed it off, then carried on with our night. Now Lima could see over my shoulder and therefore also see the creepy guy, but all I could see in front of me was her and one of the cafe's walls. So I had to rely on her to let me know if the guy was still there. I honestly expected him to just leave after such a confrontation. Everyone in the cafe was watching. It was pretty mortifying, but he didn't. He stayed put and continued to make eyes at Lima, which to her credit she just ignored. But then when it came to me walking her home, he got up and paid his bill too. Then yep, you guessed it. I looked over my shoulder as we were passing through Chinatown, and I saw tiny Mister stare out. He was still keeping up the intimidation game by staring out from under his brow, obviously too drunk to realize he looked far more comical than scary. Don't get me wrong, I wasn't exactly scared at that point, but we were being followed. It made for something of a tense situation, but nothing I thought I couldn't handle. As we approached her apartment block, I asked Lima if she was comfortable going inside while the guy could see where she lived. She admitted to being uncomfortable about it, but the block had dozens of flats in it, and unless he got in the door behind her, there was little chance of him working out which unit she lived in. But as it turned out, Lima was way more concerned about me and actually invited me inside for a nightcap. I didn't assume that I was getting lucky, but I wasn't about to turn her down. So I went inside for a cup of this weird ginger tea and the comfort that our little stalker friend would soon get bored and wander off. I was in her flat for no less than an hour, and by that time, each of us was confident that our new friend had departed. We even checked out of her bathroom window, which looked down into the street, and he was nowhere to be seen. I thanked her for a good night. We had a little smooch, and I started my walk home with that lighter-than-air feeling you get after a successful date. It's around that time that I started thinking about how strange it would be if that loser was somehow still following me, which prompted me to look over my shoulder. Lo and behold, there was a single figure following me, maybe 50 or 60 meters behind, with a remarkably similar silhouette to the lad who tried following us. I have to admit to being in a state of disbelief for a moment as I stopped and studied the figure as they approached. Then after passing under a streetlight, I got a clear look at the person. It was him. I said out loud that he had to be joking, and immediately he stopped. I knew it was him, so him playing at being a statue didn't make a blind bit of difference. I just told him to keep his distance, and there'd be no problems. Then just carried on the 20-minute walk back to my place. Every so often I checked over my shoulder, and this lad was still behind me. Granted, he was some way away, but he was definitely following me. and the closer we got to my apartment, the more it became obvious that he was making a considerable effort to close the distance. Now, unlike Lima, the apartment I lived in was just one of two in this big old Edwardian. I had the top floors, while the other tenant had the ground floor and the basement, complete with his entrance. And if this lad saw what door I went into, he'd have my flat. He wouldn't have to guess which one of 60 I was in. He would know exactly where I lived. Obviously, I was not in the least bit comfortable with that, so I decided on a little show of force to deter my new follower. I turned around and just marched right at him. Then, when I was within about spitting distance, I gave him a piece of my mind about being a creep and a loser, promising I'd hurt him if he carried on following me. It seemed to have the desired effect as he started walking off in the complete opposite direction. It was really strange, but I carried on walking, checking over my shoulder one more time, and he was gone. Problem solved, right? Well, not quite. About a minute or two went by, and I reached the entrance to a fairly small park. My flat was literally just on the other side of it, so I was in this blissful ignorance of thinking that not only had I scared the creepy guy off, but that I was so close to home that nothing could possibly hurt me now. I mean, I was on home base, right in my big old backyard. Besides, I'd had a great night. I had drinks with this gorgeous anesthesiologist, definitely securing myself a second date in the process. And I'd had myself a little tough guy moment with that absolute idiot. Then everything flashed bright for a second, and I felt my knees just buckling under me, almost as if though my brain had switched off power to them. I honestly don't know if I was knocked out for a second or two, but I do know that the next thing I could feel was this sharp, hot pain in the back left side of my head. I knew that I'd been hit by something, I just didn't know what or by whom. I was so dazed that it didn't even occur to me that it could have been him. I honestly thought I was just being mugged or something, in which case it wouldn't have been my first rodeo. I'd been mugged at knife point in London back when I was a student, and I knew to just keep my mouth shut, hand over the valuables, and get away with nothing but damaged pride and a lump on my head. So the only thing I did before trying to find my feet was to toss out my wallet and phone onto the concrete and tell whoever it was to just take it and leave. I heard someone wheeze a laugh, probably at how pathetic I looked. But when they spoke, I knew exactly who it was. He mocked me, saying he thought I was going to kick his head in and told me to look at myself now. Then he kicked me. They kicked me so hard in the side of the head that I thought my orbital socket might be broken. And in between worrying that I'd end up losing my eye if they kicked me again, it dawned on me the little Tao. Rag, who'd been following, had somehow found a way to cut me off and ambush me. And it became quite obvious that I was in much more trouble than I'd first anticipated. The phone and wallet weren't going to cut it. I needed to get on my feet, and fast. It didn't matter that I was taller and stronger, maybe even faster than this guy. He had the upper hand, and let me tell you, that was not a nice feeling. The force of the kick sent me off balance, but I tried to use the momentum to find my feet. If I was drunk, I'd have been utterly screwed, but since I was sober, I did actually manage to get both feet on the ground before trying to bring myself upright. But no. Another kick hit me right in the corner of the mouth, and I was sent flying backwards again. This time, not only was my mouth filling up with blood, but I could feel the teeth on the left-hand side of my mouth grinding together where the kick had chipped a few of them. It sent my skin crawling as I spat the blood out. I put my hand out and felt something cold and metallic, a fence on which I was once again trying to pull myself up. But again, right as I was about to find my feet, the guy attacked. Only this time, he didn't strike me. He wrapped one arm around my neck and held something cold and sharp over my right eye. I'm not sure if it was a knife or a piece of glass or whatever, but I think that was the single most terrifying moment of my life, thinking that I was going to be blind and hoping I'll be able to buck him off before he went for my throat or something. Only he didn't cut me. Instead, he hissed something right into my ear. Let's just say brevity wasn't his strong suit, and the actual words were as gloating, vicious, and vile as you can imagine, with plenty of references to the date I'd been on that evening. I didn't beg. I didn't cry. I just waited for whatever was going to happen. but thank God he must have seen sense or something. He made a comment about how I was only going to be alive the next day because he decided to let me live. After that, he gave me one more good punch to the side of the face. Then all I heard was the sound of trainers hitting concrete as he legged it. I spent the next few minutes spitting out blood as I tried to find my phone. I think he'd either stamped on it or I'd maybe tossed it with a little too much force because the screen was smashed into bits. But again, a little bit of divine intervention meant it worked just enough for me to hammer out an emergency call, after which I dragged myself to the park's gates and sat there waiting for the ambulance to turn up. Aside from a bit of concussion, a lot of swelling and some chipped teeth, I was pretty much all right. There was no skull fracture, no broken orbital socket, nothing like that. Although I'd been lucky to say the least. The doctor said the first wound on the back of my head looked like it had come from a brick or a large rock, and if he'd hit me any harder with it in that particular spot, there's a good chance he'd have just killed me with his first strike. And that was the really scary bit, thinking that all the kicks and punches and threats that came after were like a weird blessing. I was still alive when in some timelines, I would be checking in for the big sleep. I was angry about it for a long, long time. And I'd be a liar if I said I didn't let that attack change my behavior for the worse for a while. Seeing the guy getting 6 years for assault and grievous bodily harm really helped things. But still, that wasn't enough for me on some level, and it took me a while to acquiesce. Me and Lima carried on dating for a few months, which was lovely. But she had to move away for work, so obviously we had to call time on it. And the 4 trips to the dentist were terrible, as they basically had to file and cap my teeth one at a time. And that was definitely the worst part. How 5 minutes turned into an ordeal that lasted months of court dates and dental appointments. That's my one big takeaway from the whole thing, really. How one little misunderstanding can have terrifyingly far-reaching consequences.
About 8 years ago now, me and my dad and a few of my cousins were fishing down in southern Maryland one summer. We were out at the particular spot where there are these things called target ships. These are old decommissioned Navy ships that have been mounted on top of concrete pillars so they can float no matter how much the Navy tests munitions on them. They get shot at by all kinds of vehicles with all kinds of bullets, bombs, and missiles. But anyway, we're all on my dad's Grady White fishing for croaker and flounder right near these target ships. If they're actually being used for military exercises, you can't even get near them. So since there's no one out there to wave us away, we were out near the target ships with about 20 other boats in the water. But then, sure enough, about an hour and some guy from the Coast Guard sails up to us. They're on a big old CG boat with about 15 trainees on board, and the officer in command asks a favor from my dad. He wants to know if he can practice a little inspection drill with a few of his trainees. Being the good guy he is, my dad gives him permission, then renders them coming on board. I feel my rod getting all heavy all of a sudden. I call it out, and the Coast Guard officer stops his inspection and says, "Go ahead, son, reel it up. Let's see what you got." So I reel and reel, and it's really obvious how heavy whatever I've caught is. So naturally, we're all getting mad excited. Then, to all of our absolute horror, I pull the thing from the water, and we all see that it is an unexploded bomb. It was a cylindrical diamond shape with neon green stabilizers, about 12 to 14 inches long and 4 inches in diameter at its thickest part. Well, now the officer, the trainee, and the entire boat of Coast Guard has just witnessed what I pulled out of the water. And I'm not kidding when I say that. I watched the color drain from all their faces. They went from pink, unhealthy, to skeletal white. And the time it took to say the trainee on our boat literally leaves to his boat, and they all haul it away with their sirens on. This leaves a very rattled Coast Guard officer on our boat, who promptly orders me to not move a single muscle. The Coast Guard gets on our VHF and tells all the boats in the area to leave the target ships. And I'm telling you, you ain't never seen fishing boats move so fast. After about 20 minutes of me sitting there with this bomb on my line, the area is finally cleared away. The officer orders my father to put his boat and drive to achieve a good bit of speed, and then don't stop. So my dad goes as he's ordered, puts the boat in gear, and seconds, we're rolling about 50 to 20 knots away from the ship. The absurd brings out a knife, cuts my line, and orders my dad to just throttle the boat and get away as fast as you can. Needless to say, it did not detonate when it hit the bottom of the bay. We took the officer, who was pretty clearly shaken, back to his ship. I know it's hard to believe the story without proof, but in the situation, we didn't have time to get a picture of it. We tried, but the Coast Guard officer was adamant about us getting out of there as quickly as possible. But take my word for it, it's easily the scariest thing I've ever had happen to me during a fishing trip.
I have a story to share that has truly traumatized me for quite a while now. I feel like this is a good place to tell it because I need to get it out. I am from New Zealand and over here. We have the occasional missing person or a scary murder case, but it is otherwise a very safe country where not much goes on. Because of that, as a 19-year-old girl, I always felt comfortable walking the streets at night or going on hikes alone. Everyone generally looks out for one another. You don't grow up expecting danger in the woods. This happened in the summer of 2019. My boyfriend and I were headed out on a picnic date to a spot we had visited many times. It is called the Karakariki Track. It sits at the end of a very long, windy and rural farm road off of the state highway. To get there, you have to drive for about 15 minutes. You travel deep along a stretch of farmland. At the very end, there is a large cul-de-sac and a massive surrounding farm. The owners of the farm have left the land open to the public. It is a reserve because it is filled with beautiful native trees and wildlife. About a 15-minute walk from the parking lot, there is a small waterfall where you can go swimming. The track is very popular because it is one of the closest swimming spots to Hamilton, the nearest city. It is a scenic and beautiful place where you cross footbridges and pass by creek beds. Farmers still work the land, so there are fenced-off areas the public can enter while the agricultural work continues. On this particular day, my boyfriend and I were really happy. The parking lot was completely empty. It was a super hot summer's day, which was rare for that time, and we felt lucky to have the place to ourselves. As we arrived, we saw the local farmer crossing through the gate on a quad bike with his cows. He was an older man we had spoken to before, since we were regular visitors. He smiled and waved at us as he went about his work. We set off toward the waterfall, crossing a footbridge and passing through a large paddock full of cows. The track there is quite narrow, with the creek sitting right next to it down a steep bank, so you have to be careful where you step. We reached the waterfall. We decided against swimming because we realized we hadn't brought any towels. We turned around and headed back toward the car park. On our way back, we decided to take a small detour. We went down a steep gravel-off ramp from the track. This led to a more private, tree-covered area right by the water. We were enjoying the quiet, kissing and relaxing. I was lying on my tummy reading a book while my boyfriend sat up playing on his phone, rubbing my back and playing with my hair. We were there for about 10 minutes. I turned my head and glanced up the gravel path. Way up on a hill, through one of the farmer's gates, I saw a large man on a quad bike. I didn't recognize him. He was just sitting there, perfectly still, staring down at my boyfriend and me. I don't even want to think about how long he had been watching us before I noticed him. I quietly told my boyfriend what I saw, which made him turn to look as well. As soon as the man realized we were both looking at him, he opened the gate. He started driving down the hill toward us. We immediately got up to leave. We didn't want to have an awkward conversation with a farmer about being romantic on his land. That is what we assumed was about to happen. However, the situation was much worse than a simple scolding. The man came down the track and drove his quad into the creek. He left the engine running while it sat in the water and climbed off. He started talking to himself loudly, saying over and over that he had messed up his quad. He said he had damaged his engine. He seemed agitated before he even got near us. My boyfriend and I were gathering our things to leave when the man began heading toward us. He didn't offer any small talk or a friendly greeting. Instead, He immediately asked us if we had seen any fish, explaining that he was looking for some fish to kill. My boyfriend calmly responded that there were no fish in that creek because it was fresh water, suggesting that the man might have better luck trying to catch some eels instead. This suggestion sent the man into a sudden fit of anger. He yelled that he didn't want any effing eels and repeated that he wanted to kill some fish. I made a point not to look the guy in the eye. I didn't want to draw the conversation toward myself because I was already extremely freaked out. I didn't want him to notice my fear. My boyfriend was always the calmer, stronger one in situations like this. But for a brief second, I did look at the man's face. I noticed it looked slightly deformed. Since I work in aged care, I thought it might be Bell's palsy. As I stood back up from tying my shoelace, I noticed something terrifying. There was a pistol tucked into the man's waist. I want to emphasize how shocking this was. That was the first and last time I have ever seen a real-life handgun. It is incredibly hard to get a firearm in New Zealand, especially after the strict regulations following the Christchurch shooting. To make matters worse, he didn't just have one. He was waving a second pistol around in his hand as he talked to my boyfriend about killing fish. He would aim it down at the creek and swing it around. My boyfriend gave me a look that I can only describe as stern. That single look spoke a million words to me. He nodded toward the hill leading back to the track. I grabbed our 2 bags and faked a check of my phone. I told the man that our family was waiting for us back at the car park and we had to go. He completely ignored what I said. Instead, he made a comment about how I had a cool hat on, saying something completely irrelevant to the situation. I said a quick goodbye. I started making my way up the hill. In my mind, I was terrified. I didn't want to look back for fear of seeing my boyfriend get shot. I knew our best bet was for me to get up the hill onto the narrow path where the quad bike couldn't follow, then sprint toward the farmer's house. As I was walking away, the man told my boyfriend that he had a really pretty girl. It felt like all the dark intentions I didn't want to believe were confirmed. I honestly felt like I was going to die. My boyfriend, remaining brave, gave a quick thanks and said we would be off now, then followed me up the hill. Even as we moved away, the man kept talking as if the conversation was still going on. He just stood there, gun in hand, watching us leave. As soon as we were out of his sight, we sprinted as fast as we could all the way back to the car park. When we got there, we noticed empty gun shells. There were over 10 shells scattered on the ground. We ran into 2 girls in bikinis who were arriving and quickly informed them about the man and the gun. They got into their cars and left immediately. We tried to go to the farmer's house to see if he knew who the man was, but the farmers weren't home anymore. The thought of those guns still haunts me. They looked old and rusty. My boyfriend suggested they might have been illegal heirlooms handed down to him. This incident has stayed with me for years. My boyfriend and I haven't been able to return to that spot, which is heartbreaking because it's where we had our first date. For about a year afterward, I had to drive past the road leading to that track during my commute, and it always made me feel physically sick. I could have lost my life or my partner that day. I am forever grateful for the man my boyfriend is. He was able to stay calm and lead us away. He communicated exactly what I needed to do through just a look. He told me afterward that he was ready to die if he had to. Knowing the man had been watching us from the hill and hearing his compliment made it clear that he had very scary intentions. This experience has changed me. I am much more fearful now when I travel into the bush alone, something I had done happily my entire life.
When I was 10 years old, my life changed completely because my family moved to a new house after my dad accepted a job offer. It was a difficult time for me. I had to leave my old neighborhood. I had to say goodbye to all my friends and start over. Both my sister and I found it hard to get used to things in this unfamiliar place. One afternoon, we were feeling quite bored. We decided to take a hike to explore the new woods surrounding our property. The forest was most dense directly behind our house, where the sound of a running stream filled the air. We had been walking for about an hour when a loud snap came from the nearby bushes, which immediately freaked out my little sister. She had always been a jumpy person, but I was stubborn. I insisted that we carry on with our adventure. It was roughly 5 minutes after that initial sound when nature suddenly went silent all around us. It felt like we were being watched. I know it sounds like a cliche, but it truly felt like there wasn't just the two of us out there. I was certain that something was hiding in the shadows, staring right at us. Then, the heavy silence of the forest was broken by a strange yell. It sounded like a screeching cat, but the noise was more drawn out and much, much deeper. This was immediately followed by the distressed call of a deer, and then everything went back to utter silence. Because the call had come from only about 100 yards away, we panicked and bolted. Whatever was out there began gaining on us quickly. In my absolute panic, I pushed my sister into a thick thorn bush and followed right after her. I was too shocked to even feel the pain. We held each other tightly in our hiding spot until we heard a deep growl coming from our right. Slowly, we turned our heads to look, bracing ourselves to come face to face with a beast. However, when we looked, there was nothing there. Instead, a horrific stench hit us, a smell like sulfur, bodily waste, and copper. Then we heard a scratching sound coming from above us. We snapped our heads up to look. What we saw would scar us for the rest of our lives. We saw a creature with a body shape similar to a panther. It was light gray with a distinct black stripe running down its spine. Its head looked more like a boar's head, and its feet were like the paws of a dog, yet it had no tail. Its eyes were a misty blue, making it look as though it were blind. Suddenly, the creature snapped its head to look directly at us, and I swear that it smiled. It was a sight that no human being should ever have to see. It had teeth like sharp razors, and red fluid seemed to be dripping from its yellowish fang. We turned and ran. We ran as fast as we could, and we did not look back once. We kept running even as the sounds of branches snapping and the deep growls and grunts of the creature echoed behind us. When we finally reached the edge of our property, the sound of the heavy paw steps faded away. We ran straight to our front door, threw it open, and slammed it shut. We were so overwhelmed by exhaustion and terror that we passed out on the couch immediately. My sister and I still talk about this incident to this day. Every single time we bring it up, that same spark of fear blazes in her eyes.
My name is Ayla. I am 33 years old now, but from the age of 19 until I turned 23, my life was defined by an addiction to heroin. The story of how I first started using is a long one, but there is a different story that carries more weight for me. It is the story of how I finally got clean. Calling it a better story is a stretch, because the reality of it is horrifying. However, it provided the brutal wake-up call I needed to save my own life. So I suppose there is a silver lining buried somewhere in the tragedy. About 18 months into my addiction, the thin stability I had left completely vanished. I was kicked out of my apartment, and my family, understandably exhausted by my choices, cut ties with me. I found myself living on the streets. At 21 years old, standing only 5 feet 2 inches tall, and weighing barely over 100 pounds, I was incredibly vulnerable. Looking back, I realize I should have been terrified, but at the time, my mind was entirely consumed by the constant need to find my next fix. Even so, the reality of being a young woman without a home is a nightmare I wouldn't wish on anyone. The first lesson you learn in that environment is the necessity of protection. It is a hard truth to admit, but survival often depends on having someone by your side. I was more fortunate than most. While many women are forced into dangerous situations for safety, I connected with a man who was also an addict and had been using for about as long as I had. He was only a few years older than me, and our bond wasn't just about the logistics of scoring drugs. We truly liked one another. Over time, that connection grew into a deep, genuine love. We spent 2 years navigating the world together. We faced the constant cycle of trying to quit, failing, and enduring the daily hardships of the lifestyle. The most important part of that time was the word together. He was my entire world, and I was his. He would do anything to keep me safe, from stealing to protect our interests, to physically defending me when things turned ugly. When we were eventually arrested for shoplifting and sentenced to 3 months in county jail, the separation was agonizing. I missed him more than I had ever missed my own family. I struggled to get by while he was locked away, so when the day of his release finally arrived, I was overwhelmed with relief. I actually cried with joy when I saw him again. While he was in jail, the system had forced him to get clean, but the moment he hit the pavement, his first instinct was to get high. I had anticipated this and prepared a small homecoming gift, a $10 bag of heroin. We quickly scouted out a quiet, secluded spot where we wouldn't be disturbed, eager to finally relax and be in each other's company again. He took his hit first, and then I used the rest of the supply. Afterward, we settled into each other's arms to sleep. It was a moment of closeness I had craved for months, a feeling of safety that is hard to put into words. As I drifted off, I felt him start to pull away slightly. I assumed he just needed to get up for a moment to use the bathroom. In my drug-induced haze and my desperation to keep him close, I reached out and tugged on his sleeve. I didn't want him to leave the embrace. I felt like I had waited an eternity for that cuddle, and I told myself he could surely wait just one more minute. When I finally opened my eyes again, I could still feel his arm draped around me. Coming down from a high makes the world feel sluggish and confusing, like your brain is struggling to log back into reality. For a brief second, I felt a wave of warmth and comfort. I wiggled closer to him, pulling his arm tighter against my body. I reached down to find his hand, intending to lace my fingers through his the way he always liked. That was when the warmth vanished. His hand wasn't just cold from the autumn Chicago air. It was a deep, heavy, stone-cold chill that bypassed the skin and went straight to my bones. It was the kind of cold that immediately signals that something is fundamentally wrong. I scrambled out from under him and spun around, frantically trying to shake him awake. When he didn't move, I let out a scream so violent that I physically became ill. The noise drew someone nearby to check on us, and the rest of the afternoon became a blurred montage of sirens, EMTs, and police officers asking endless questions. It was an overdose. After being clean for months in jail, his tolerance had dropped significantly. His body simply couldn't handle the dose. The realization that haunted me most was the memory of him pulling away. He hadn't been trying to go to the bathroom. He had been struggling to get help as his body began to shut down. While he was slipping into unconsciousness and passing away, I had been holding him tight, forcing him to stay still so I could enjoy the moment. I had slept next to his body for 5 or 6 hours. That image is something I carry with me every single day. Now, whenever I think about my recovery and how grateful I am to be sober, that memory is the very first thing that comes to mind. It serves as a permanent anchor to my past. I still find it impossible to say or type his name. Doing so triggers a level of grief that feels like it might tear me apart. Even though we were living a life of addiction, my love for him was the most real thing I had. I am plagued by the feeling that I am responsible for his death. He was clean when he walked out of those jail doors, and I was the one who handed him the very thing that killed him. It is a weight I carry constantly, a guilt that I suspect I will never truly be able to leave behind.
Back when I was a teenager, me and my brother were absolutely obsessed with fishing. We still enjoy the occasional trip all these years later. Don't get me wrong, but back then we lived and breathed river fishing. So much so that we used to participate in fishing tournaments and therefore had to take part in training sessions every other day. Spoilers, but these training sessions were just an excuse to get some time in by the river, and I won't bore you with how the fishing tournaments work. So just take our word that we fished an awful lot. Anyway, I was like 13 years old. It was September, and me and my brother were fishing down at this river bend out in the sticks. Now, you gotta keep in mind that in river and lake fishing, you gotta be quiet as a mouse unless you scare the fish away. So as the skies darkened, this low rumbling of thunder echoed around the sky. Well, you can imagine how creepy that was. We're expecting rain, but that doesn't mean we're going to stop fishing. And it has to take much more than that to scare us off. And cue the appearance of some creepy stranger who walks out of the woods on the other side of the river. He doesn't have any gear with him besides the rod. But he's got a fishing hat on one that has all his scraggly gray hair tumbling out from under it. We try to wave hi, but he just gives us this look as if to say, "You're in my spot." And me and my brother are getting ready to pack up if he asks us, because God knows people can get really territorial about their favorite spot being crept on. But the guy doesn't say anything. And he just walks about 100 yards upstream and starts fishing up there. Alright, he was kind of choking off our spot. But we were never ones to back away from a challenge. So we stayed put. As we're fishing, the thunder and lightning get louder and louder, and the gaps between them shorter and shorter, meaning it's slowly traveling right above our heads. I end up looking upstream to see if the grumpy old dude is still there, and he is. But then I notice how his rod is bending and doesn't sit right with me. It looks nice and strong, but way too flexible to be anything other than carbon fiber. At least, that was my guess. But here's the thing. Although you don't think of carbon fiber as being metal, it's super conductive to electricity. Meaning, if this guy really was using a carbon fiber rod, it wasn't so much a fishing rod as a lightning rod. I remember whispering to my brother, like, "I think that guy's using carbon fiber." To which he replies, "He's old. Is that Tom? Look at the way the thing's bend, though," I remember saying. My brother looks again, and that's when he sees what I'm seeing. And then out of nowhere, this huge crack and flash let us know that we've just been within 100 yards of a lightning strike that impacted really close to our grumpy fishing guy. We get up and just hightail it over to where he was standing, and there's this guy's rod laying there in the dirt smoking. We started looking around for the guy to see if he was okay, but we couldn't find anything. Not a single trace of this dude. But then my brother finds one of the guy's boots lying near the root of the tree that's smoking too. And that's when he looks up. We finally find where the guy went. The lightning had blown this poor sob right up into a tree. We bailed to the nearest gas station to call the EMTs, but by that time, the guy was long dead. And there was no saving him. This was a long time ago, and a memory that stuck with me for a long time, and it was truly very hard to get back into fishing after that. But of all the freaky occurrences that kind of came out of that, the one thing that really stuck with me was the smell in the air when we finally found him. It honestly smelled like barbecue pork.
In the early hours of Sunday, September 17, 1995, 25-year-old Timothy Stone was driving his young family back from a cookout in their native city of Los Angeles. In the vehicle were his 26-year-old partner, Robin Cohen, her 5-year-old son, Christopher, her 3-year-old daughter, Stephanie, and their 2-year-old brother, Joseph. Timothy was not familiar with the Cypress Park neighborhood they were passing through, and since it was nearly 2 in the morning, he did not have a clear view of his surroundings. To make matters worse, many of the streetlights in the area had been shot out, leaving the roads in near total darkness. At a fork in the road, Timothy accidentally turned onto the 2000 block of Isabel Street. This was a dark, narrow, dead-end alley, covered in gang-related graffiti, including one chilling message that read Avenida de los Asesinos, or the Street of Killers. Timothy had taken a wrong turn that led his family into one of the most dangerous areas in California, the territory of a street gang known as the Avenues. This group was notorious as one of Los Angeles' most violent Latino gang sets and had a long history of involvement with the Mexican mafia. Their belief system was built on respect, loyalty, and secrecy, and they met any perceived challenge to their authority with swift, brutal ferocity. When up to 20 members of the gang saw an unknown vehicle entering the heart of their territory, they viewed it as a direct threat to their control. The Avenues were also infamous for committing anti-black hate crimes against innocent residents. Their violence had become so prolific that some observers described their actions as a campaign of ethnic cleansing, directed at honest, hard-working members of the black community in Los Angeles. However, as the gang members surrounded the car, it was clear that Timothy and his family were not rival gangsters or undercover officers. They appeared to be a regular Caucasian couple, and the presence of small children in the car made it obvious that this was not a law enforcement operation. Despite this, the gang members began to attack. Timothy and Robin were terrified as the first of several trash cans was smashed into their vehicle. This appeared to be the gang's way of ordering Timothy to leave, and he immediately tried to make an erratic U-turn. Instead of letting them go, other members threw large steel trash cans in front of the wheels to slow the car down, allowing the group to completely surround the family. Both Timothy and Robin pleaded with the men to let them pass. The gang members refused, demanding to know why the couple was in their neighborhood. Timothy apologized repeatedly, but his pleas were ignored. One of the gang members then produced a pistol, aimed it directly at Timothy's face, and threatened to shoot him. In a state of total panic, Timothy decided to accelerate, driving into the human roadblock in a desperate attempt to escape. By that time, multiple gang members were armed, and as the car moved forward, they fired their weapons into the windshield. Numerous bullets ripped through the car, hitting both the upholstery and the passengers inside. One bullet struck 3-year-old Stephanie in the head while she was being held in her mother's arms. Her 2-year-old brother Joseph was hit in the left foot, and a bullet grazed Timothy's back. The family managed to drive away and rushed to the hospital, hoping the children could be saved. While Joseph eventually made a full recovery, medical staff were unable to revive young Stephanie. She passed away just a few hours later. Her grieving parents were only a few feet away, behind a closed door, when her time of death was officially called. The murder of the young girl sparked widespread anger across the country. Former President Bill Clinton reflected the national mood, stating that the family had taken a single wrong turn. Because they were in the wrong place, gang members believed they had the right to shoot at them and kill an innocent child. Many people struggled to understand how such a senseless killing could happen. As journalists began investigating Cypress Park, the public learned about the daily horrors faced by the neighborhood's residents. Innocent people were frequently caught in the crossfire of gang wars. The gang's initiation rites often required new members to shoot at civilians to prove their loyalty. It was a place where a simple trip to the store for milk could result in death. This occurred for no reason other than being randomly chosen. Many Americans were shocked that such violence was happening in their own country, but for those living in the area, it was a daily reality. Stephanie Cohen was laid to rest a week later. 12 Los Angeles police officers served as an honor guard, and 4 generations of the Cohen family gathered at the Church of the Recessional in Glendale. During the service, a cousin referred to Stephanie as an angel. By the time of the funeral, the investigation into her killers was nearly finished. Police had profiles on the local gang members and were focused on finding the specific gunmen. Shortly after, 28-year-old Anthony Gabriel Rodriguez, 22-year-old Manuel Rosales Jr., and 18-year-old Hugo David Gomez were arrested. They were charged with the attack on the family that had simply been unlucky enough to take a wrong turn. At the conclusion of their trial on August 1, 1997, a judge sentenced all 3 men to 54 years to life in state prison. They were sent to separate facilities located on opposite sides of California. The public felt a sense of relief that justice had been served for Stephanie. However, the United States has continued to struggle with violent gang activity in many major cities. With cities like St. Louis and Baltimore maintaining high murder rates, there is a persistent concern that other innocent families might one day find themselves in the wrong place at the wrong time. They may face similar senseless violence.
I truly hate mukbangs. They're incredibly annoying and disgusting to watch. In my opinion, gluttony is not a trait that should be glorified by society, and I have a specific story that explains why I feel this way. At the time, I was a small guy living in a modest 2-room apartment with my girlfriend. She worked as a publicist for a specific influencer who made a living by filming himself eating massive amounts of food, because her job required constant meetups with him. I used to join her on these visits, though I was mostly annoyed by his personality. Things were always messy at his house. It was a large, pretentious mansion. It felt very uncomfortable. He would constantly start his recordings with an annoying, loud voice to introduce himself. I was always weirded out by the setting of his home and the strange energy of his career. During one of his filming sessions, he tried to call me onto his channel to participate in the meal. He asked me why I wouldn't just come and join them for the video. I refused his offer and told him that I was fine, but he kept insisting. Eventually, he looked at me and asked if I had a personal problem with him. I told him directly that I simply did not like to be on camera or engage in gluttonous eating. He was very quick to take offense at my choice of words and looked extremely bitter about the rejection. When we got back home, my girlfriend mentioned that he was pissed and annoyed by my behavior. I told her that I was just as annoyed with him, but she informed me that he was demanding a formal apology. I initially refused to give him one, however. My girlfriend warned me that he was a total psycho who would do anything to get what he wanted. I eventually told her I would do it a day later. I just wanted to move on. That same night, he suddenly barged into our little apartment with his men. They grabbed my girlfriend and me, tied us up and warned us that we were going to do the mukbang. With a gun held to our heads and a camera positioned in front of us, he pulled out a mountain of food that was enough to feed 10 people. Because we were absolutely terrified, we obeyed. We decided to do exactly as we were told. We stuffed ourselves with the food despite knowing our bodies could not take it. We eventually puked, but we were forced to continue eating and eating. We ate every bit of it until we genuinely felt like we were going to die. Suddenly, the influencer started shouting and pointing his fingers at us. He announced that the entire thing was just a prank. He claimed that we had been fooled. He laughed and told us to relax because he had caught the whole prank on camera. My girlfriend and I were far too traumatized to even react in that moment. The next morning, I went to the station and filed a police complaint against the psychopath. Upon further negotiation, he tried to reimburse us for the emotional pain he had caused us. He ended up paying us $200,000 for his prank. I demanded that he apologize to us directly. However, he never actually apologized to our faces. My girlfriend was given a different influencer to manage. This idiot made a YouTube apology video instead. He actually made money from the views on his apology. He was nothing more than a gluttonous, psychopathic mukbang eater. And now, every time I walk through the front door, I remember him barging in with his men. We tried to use the money to forget, but the walls remind us of the fear. I look at the floor where we were tied up and I feel sick. My girlfriend stays quiet when she sees a camera. We eat our small meals in silence now. That influencer is still famous and rich, while we are trapped in the place where he hurt us. The trauma never truly leaves this home. After that whole messed up situation, things didn't exactly go back to normal, but we managed to survive. My girlfriend, bless her, somehow stuck by me, and we eventually got married, still living in that same little 2-room apartment. Then came the biggest, most wonderful change. She got pregnant. She was 8 months along now, maybe a little more. She was glowing and healthy, but our financial situation went from bad to worse when the company we worked for shut down. We tried doing script work for other influencers, but it was not nearly enough to book a decent hospital for the baby's arrival, which was coming any day now. The stress was immense. Then, like a bad dream revisiting, he messaged. He did not message me, thankfully, but my wife. A notification popped up on her phone from the mukbang guy and my blood ran cold. She told me he wanted a deal. He offered $500,000 in exchange for 3 videos, 12 minutes each. $500,000 was an obscene amount of money. It was life-changing. It was enough for the hospital and everything we needed for the baby. However, the cost was going back into that world. We talked for hours. The trauma of before weighing heavily on us. My wife said softly while resting her hand on her belly that we needed the money. She acknowledged that she knew it was him, but the necessity was too great. I squeezed her hand and told her, We would do it for the sake of the baby, even though the words felt like ash in my mouth. We messaged back just one word, okay? A few hours later, $200,000 hit our account, and the deal was sealed. The first video was bizarre and disturbing. He wanted me to eat fast food scattered directly on the floor. It felt degrading, unsanitary, and just plain wrong. It only got about 12,000 views, which made it a total flop. His career was clearly not reviving. The second video was even weirder, involving me eating while shaving my beard. Again, it felt like he was just trying to humiliate me. It got 4,500 views. We were 2 videos in with 0 success. Pressure mounted for the third video. He insisted my wife had to be in this one. Reluctantly, with fear churning inside us, we agreed. We went to his house, which was even dirtier than before. He was bigger than I remembered, easily 500 pounds or maybe more. He seemed almost molded into the sofa. The concept for the third video was a healthy pregnancy mukbang. My wife sat beside him while I stayed behind the camera. He just passed her fruits, dry fruits, salads, and milkshakes. It was supposed to be a wholesome thing. We were about 6 minutes into the recording when suddenly my wife gasped. Her hand flew to her belly and her eyes went wide with alarm. I whispered a question to her, lowering the camera slightly to see. She choked out that her water had just broken and I could see a fresh stain spreading on her dress. Panic seized me. This was it. I stepped from behind the camera and told him we had to go. I turned to the mukbang guy, who was just staring at us. I apologized and explained that we couldn't finish the video because we needed to get to the hospital immediately. He didn't move his huge, static frame. His small eyes narrowed with a chilling anger. He boomed a refusal, shouting that we were under contract and that there were still 6 minutes left. He commanded us to get back on camera. My wife whimpered as tears welled. He looked monstrous, like a true hippo. He looked like he could devour both of us if we didn't obey. I was terrified and my legs were trembling. But then I saw my wife in pain, scared and vulnerable. I cursed myself for putting her in this situation and for letting greed outweigh the memory of what he truly was. I had to overcome the fear, so I gathered every scrap of courage I had left. I looked him dead in the eye and raised the camera I was holding. Then I deliberately dropped it. It clattered loudly on the dirty floor. I told him with a steady voice that we were leaving. I grabbed my wife's arm and pulled her up gently. He shrieked that we couldn't leave because we had signed the contract, and he struggled slightly in his chair. But he couldn't move. That weight was his prison. We ran out of that awful house as fast as we could. Behind us, his screams echoed, filled with impotent rage. Getting my wife to the hospital was all that mattered in that moment. She was scared and exhausted, but she was finally safe. Soon after, our beautiful baby was born. As for the video, the 9 minutes we recorded went massively viral. It got 56 million views because of the drama. The footage of my pregnant wife's water breaking, my panic, me dropping the camera and his screaming was a total train wreck, but it was real to the viewers. It actually ended up reviving his career. I still don't know if he will ever pay the remaining $300,000.
I am originally from Belarus, though I live in the United States now. I obtained my very first job under the table during the early to mid-1990s. At the time, I was only 12 or 13 years old. My role was to serve as a helper in my father's barbershop. My duties were simple. I spent most of my time sweeping up piles of hair, scrubbing the bathroom, taking out the trash, and handling various chores of that nature. We lived and worked in a small area located near the border with Poland. This was a pivotal era in history because Lukashenko had just ascended to power, and the Soviet Union had recently dissolved. These were incredibly difficult and dark times for everyone in the region. Mass starvation and crushing poverty swallowed the land entirely. In fact, these systemic problems still plague that area today. But I should get back to the story. I was at the barbershop with my father, whom I called Papa. We really only saw the same few regulars every week. Most people in our area chose to cut their own hair, or had a family member do it. Maintaining a barbershop was actually one of the only private enterprises possible during the Soviet Union era. As the day went by, the sky began to grow dark. Papa told me to finish cleaning up and then head right home. After giving me this lecture, he left me alone in the barbershop so he could go find a place to drink by himself. I finished my chores as instructed, locked the front door, and finally began the long walk home. This was a very rural area. It wasn't exactly the deep countryside, but everything was spaced out significantly. It was hard to maintain any real sense of community there, so everyone usually stuck to themselves and valued their privacy. As I was walking along the road, I suddenly realized that I had forgotten to take out the final bag of garbage. I turned around to head back to the shop. When I turned, I noticed a Lada driving behind me. The strange thing was that it had no lights on. I believe the driver was actually coasting, as there was no audible sound of an engine humming. We were also traveling slightly downhill. Since I had reversed, I was walking uphill. The car passed me by and I felt somewhat at ease. However, when the Lada reached the bottom of the hill, the driver cranked the engine on and made a sudden U-turn. They pulled up right beside me. I could see a man and a woman sitting inside. The man driving the car called out to me, asking if I wanted a lift to wherever I was going. I told them no thanks, and explained my destination was nearby. I also honestly told them that they were severely creeping me out. They became visibly offended that I had called them creepy. They began to yell at me loudly, calling me all sorts of nasty names and shouting at me. They hoped I would slip and crack my head open on the ground. Figuring they were probably just drunk and belligerent, I told them to F off. Then, I cut through the grass and trees to get off the road. I took a shortcut through a small wooded area that I knew would eventually link back to the street on the other side. I assumed that by the time I reached the exit, some time would have passed and they would be gone. Yet, when I reached the other side, the same Lada was idling on the road waiting. At this point, I was getting extremely agitated rather than scared. I came from a home with an alcoholic father and was a Slav squat kid. I was quite used to confronting aggressive adults. With my attitude, that also meant I was used to being beaten by adults. Because of this, random people acting tough didn't intimidate me much. It sounds edgy, but you get used to it. You learn to read a person to see if they're actually going to attack a child. You would be surprised by how many adults actually do. Filled with anger, I walked directly up to the car and confronted the man. I asked him why he was following me, and if he liked me or wanted a kid for some reason. I told him he should go be with the woman in the car and leave me alone. The man paused for a second and then put his hand up to the window. He was holding a gun, or at least something that looked exactly like one. It was dark, so I couldn't see perfectly. He told me that I could either have a good night or my last night. He said that if I got in the car, we could drive around and drink vodka, but if I refused, he would kill me. Ironically, while I had been in plenty of fistfights with adults before, I had never been confronted with a firearm. I didn't know exactly what to do, but I knew for certain I wasn't getting into that freak's car. I hesitated for a moment and then lied. I told them okay and said I would get in, acting as if I were going along with their plan. I walked over to the passenger side of the vehicle. The woman opened her door and got out to let me into the back seat. I believe she was about to say something patronizing like "good boy," but as she stepped out, I kicked her in the leg. I kicked as hard as I possibly could and immediately bolted. She yelped in pain and fell over. By the time they realized what had happened, I was already back in the safety of the trees. It was a circular wooded area surrounded by roads, similar to a large roundabout, which allowed me to get to the center where they couldn't see me. They had no way of knowing which side I would eventually come out on. I sat and waited in the dark center for a long time. Once I decided enough time had passed, I exited on the side nearest the barbershop. I sprinted from the woods, up the road, and straight back into the shop. I unlocked the door, jumped inside, locked it behind me, and stayed there for the entire night. In the morning, my father showed up at the shop. Instead of being relieved, he beat me for never coming home. I tried to explain the kidnapping attempt and even tried to describe the car in detail, but that only made him angrier. He accused me of lying, and told me I was just using stories from the news. Unfortunately, these types of events were common back then. It wasn't an everyday occurrence for one person, but reported kidnappings had become as common as car break. In Zarin, America, it turned out these two people had gone around the entire village that day, asking any kids they saw if they wanted a lift. There were other reports of them making threats as well. After my experience, I paid very close attention to the news, in hopes of seeing that those people had been caught. Instead, I only saw headlines about more children going missing. There was a terrifying abundance of missing kids over those few months. It was widely assumed that these children had their organs harvested, were trafficked to other countries, or were even killed and eaten due to the mass starvation. Unless you were like my family or were relatively wealthy by the standards of the day, it was very likely that you didn't eat much at all. This desperation led to unspeakable horrors.
Last summer, I was 21 years old and enjoying a family vacation at Myrtle Beach. We were staying in a high-rise resort, positioned somewhere around the 13th or 14th floor in a timeshare unit. One particular night, restlessness took hold of me. I found myself tossing and turning, unable to find the comfort of sleep. By 3 a.m., the quiet of the room became stifling. Consequently, I decided to step out onto the balcony to breathe in some fresh night air. The sight from the balcony was breathtaking. A full moon hung in the sky, casting a brilliant, shimmering path of light across the ocean waves. Looking down, I noticed the beach was entirely deserted, a rare sight for such a popular destination. The stillness was captivating. Since sleep remained elusive, I figured a short walk on the sand might help me relax. I planned to listen to some music and clear my head, hoping that a bit of physical activity would finally make me tired enough to rest. In hindsight, it was a foolish and unsafe decision to head out alone at that hour. However, because my family was fast asleep, I chose not to wake anyone or leave a note. I rationalized the choice by telling myself I would only be gone for 10 or 15 minutes. I just wanted a quick moment of solitude before returning to bed. The base of our resort featured a pool area and an outdoor bar. Beyond that, 2 separate boardwalks, spaced about 100 feet apart, led through the tall seagrass and down to the shore. When I reached the ground level, the resort grounds were as empty as the beach had appeared from above. I chose the boardwalk on the right and began making my way toward the water. As I walked down the wooden path, a figure appeared, coming from the direction of the beach. This caught me off guard because I had just scanned that very area from my balcony and hadn't seen a single soul. My pulse quickened slightly as the person drew closer. Under the dim glow of the outdoor bar lights, I could see it was a man, likely in his late 30s. He wore a backpack and a pair of glasses with large, square frames. He looked incredibly tense and alert, scanning his surroundings as if he were searching for someone or expecting a clandestine meeting. His clothes appeared tattered and worn. As we crossed paths, we made brief eye contact. I gave him a small, polite nod and continued past him, but a wave of unease washed over me. He reminded me strangely of Jeffrey Dahmer because of those glasses, and he didn't look like someone who was staying at a high-end resort. I tried to dismiss the feeling, putting my headphones in to focus on the music. Upon reaching the sand, I turned right and began walking parallel to the ocean. I took off my shoes and moved closer to the shoreline so I could feel the cool water on my feet. I walked for about a minute, trying to enjoy the scenery. A sudden, primal instinct told me that something was wrong. I pulled my headphones down and glanced over my shoulder. A dark figure was trailing me further up the shore, positioned strategically between me and the resort. Based on the man's height and movement, I knew immediately it was the same person I had passed on the boardwalk. Panic began to set in, and my mind flooded with every horror story I had ever heard. Still, I tried to remain logical. I told myself it might just be a coincidence. Perhaps the man had simply decided to take a walk as well, and happened to be moving in the same direction. To calm my nerves, I took a few deep breaths and turned my gaze back toward the horizon, maintaining my pace. After a few more seconds, I checked again. My heart sank when I realized he had closed the gap significantly. He wasn't just walking parallel to me anymore. He was angled directly toward me. I quickened my pace, and to my horror, he immediately matched my speed, continuing his diagonal path toward the water's edge. A part of me tried to deny the reality of the situation. I thought that maybe he just preferred walking by the water and wasn't actually stalking me. Seeking to confirm my theory, I performed a complete 180-degree turn and started walking the opposite way. As I turned my head, I saw him mirror my movement perfectly. He was now power walking, aggressively closing the distance between us. The gravity of the situation finally hit me. I broke into a full run along the shoreline. He immediately began running too. He stayed higher up on the beach, cutting off my path to the resort boardwalks. If I tried to head for safety, he would be able to intercept me before I reached the stairs. With no clear plan, I simply kept running. I was young and relatively fit, so I hoped I could outlast him. I hoped I could find another exit further down the beach and eventually find a way back to the road or call for help. We ran like that for what felt like 15 minutes. The most terrifying aspect was the absolute silence of the night. There was no wind, no voices, only the sound of my own heavy breathing and the rhythmic thud of my feet hitting the wet sand. Every time I looked back, his shadowy figure was there, keeping pace and lurking in the darkness upshore. Eventually, I spotted a small, flickering blue light ahead on the sand. As I got closer, I saw a group of 4 people sitting on a blanket. They were positioned higher up on the beach. I decided to make a break for them, thinking that even if he tried to cut me off, I could reach them first. I hoped that by alerting them, we could confront the man together. I used the last of my energy to sprint toward the group. However, as I arrived, my hope vanished. The scene was one of total intoxication. There were 4 men surrounded by several large bottles of liquor. Most were empty, and the last was nearly gone. 3 of the men were completely passed out, unresponsive to the world. The 4th man was barely upright, wearing a party hat adorned with blue LED lights. He was mumbling to himself, his eyes glazed over and half closed. He didn't even notice me standing 5 feet away from him. I looked back and saw that my pursuer had slowed down. He was watching me, and I could almost see him processing the state of the group. Realizing they were no threat to him and no help to me, he suddenly began sprinting toward me again. As he entered the glow of the blue party lights, his face became clear. He looked manic, his eyes wide and fixed on me as he barreled forward at full speed. I knew I had to do something drastic. I had exhausted myself sprinting to the drunk group. I feared that, in a long-distance race, he might eventually overtake me. Instead of turning and running away from him, I suddenly lunged forward, sprinting directly toward him and then veering sharply to the right. The move caught him completely off guard. He stumbled as he tried to adjust his momentum, allowing me to slip past him. I didn't look back. I just ran with every ounce of strength I had left toward the resort. The adrenaline was overwhelming. It felt like one of those nightmares where a killer is inches away from grabbing you. Every hair on my neck was standing on end. As the resort loomed closer, I finally dared to glance over my shoulder. He was still following, but he was now 400 or 500 feet behind me. He had lost significant ground. I didn't slow down for a second. I raced up the boardwalk and burst into the resort area. I reached the elevators and pounded the buttons until the doors opened. Once inside, I frantically mashed the closed door button, gasping for air as the metal sliders finally met. When I reached my floor, I sprinted down the hallway, fumbled with my key, and practically fell into the room. I slammed the door, engaged the deadbolt, and leaned against the wood, trembling. I stayed on the floor for a long time, my chest heaving, trying to process the terror of the last 30 minutes. I eventually crawled to my bedroom, staying low to the floor because I was terrified he might be able to see me through the balcony glass from somewhere outside. Needless to say, I stayed awake until the sun came up, and I never went for a late-night walk alone again.
The separation of my parents occurred before I was born, which meant my childhood was split between 2 different homes. Every summer until I reached 19, I traveled to rural Missouri to stay with my father. He had been raised in that same countryside, and the majority of his relatives still lived in a small community. Since there were no movie theaters or typical city entertainment, I spent most of those long, humid days following my older cousin around. We were constantly looking for ways to get into mischief or exploring the dense woods that surrounded my father's property. During one of our usual treks through the wilderness, we stumbled upon a massive lake hidden deep in the middle of nowhere. It sat there quietly, undisturbed by the outside world. The water was remarkably clear, and as we looked closer, we could see an incredible number of huge fish swimming just beneath the surface. When we returned home and asked the adults about the spot, none of them seemed to know it existed. We figured that was why the fish had grown to such monstrous sizes. No one in the area was fishing there. Anyone who had found it in the past must have kept the location a secret or simply forgotten it. We returned to that hidden pond 3 or 4 times after that, and every single trip resulted in a stringer heavy with large fish. On our 5th visit, we had a specific goal in mind. The summer was drawing to a close, and we wanted to gather enough fish for a large family fry to celebrate the end of the season. We set out on a warm Saturday morning, leaving about an hour before the sun came up. The hike into the woods took over an hour, and we knew the fish would stop biting once the afternoon heat set in. Our plan was to finish early and make it back to my father's house by the start of the afternoon. The sight of the pond at dawn was beautiful. As soon as we cast our lines, the fish started biting almost immediately. For the next few hours, it was constant action, with one fish after another being pulled from the clear water. By late morning, around 10:45, we had reached our limit. I was anxious to start the long walk back. We were carrying 2 5-gallon buckets filled to the brim with our catch, and I knew the 90-minute trek would be even slower with the extra weight. However, my cousin had other ideas. He decided he wanted to take a swim in the lake before we left. He tried to convince me to jump in with him, but I didn't know how to swim at the time. Despite my desire to leave, he was older and in charge, so I had no choice but to wait. I sat down on a large rock and watched as he prepared for his swim. There was an old, weathered rope tied to a tree limb hanging over the water, looking as though it had been there for a century. My cousin decided he wanted to use it as a swing. I told him it looked dangerous and expressed my concerns, but he just laughed at me. He stripped down to his boxers, left his clothes in a pile next to me, and climbed up into the tree. After grabbing the rope, he pushed off and swung out over the lake. The rope snapped right above him before he reached the peak of his swing. He hit the deep water with a heavy, dull thud. At first, I prepared myself to laugh and tease him about the rope breaking, but as the seconds ticked by, he did not come back to the surface. The silence became terrifying. I scanned the water, hoping to see him pop up further away or perhaps floating if the impact had knocked him out. But there was nothing. Panic began to set in. I waded into the water as far as I felt safe, desperately searching the depths. However, every step I took stirred up the silt, making the water cloudy and impossible to see through. It eventually became clear that he had drowned. I felt completely helpless, wondering if I could have saved him if only I knew how to swim. With nothing else I could do, I packed up our gear and began the walk home alone. The walk back was agonizing. A tiny part of me hoped that this was all a cruel joke, and that he would jump out from behind a tree to surprise me. That moment never came. The weight of the news I had to deliver grew heavier with every step. When I finally reached my family, I tried to explain what happened, but the words kept getting stuck in my throat. Finally, I managed to tell them that Mark had drowned. Once I regained some composure, I led my father and uncle back through the woods to the pond. We searched the area, but there was still no sign of his body. We eventually had to go to the sheriff's office to report the incident officially. As we approached the station, I began to freak out. In my young mind, I was certain I would be blamed for the accident. The adults eventually calmed me down and assured me I wasn't in trouble, but the guilt remained. Every time I looked at my uncle, I felt responsible. Even though he told me he didn't blame me, I found it hard to believe he didn't hold some small resentment toward me for being the one who came home. I gave my statement to the sheriff. A formal search was scheduled for the following morning. As it turned out, that was the same day I was scheduled to return to my mother's house. On Monday night, my mother sat me down to give me an update. She told me that a team of divers had successfully recovered Mark's body earlier that day. They explained that one of his feet had become tangled in a sunken log, which was why he had been unable to resurface. Hearing the details didn't make the pain go away, but the tragedy changed the course of my life. The experience served as a powerful motivation for me to finally learn how to swim. The guilt of being unable to help stayed with me for decades, and I vowed never to be in a position where I was unable to assist someone in danger again. In a strange and painful way, his passing had a lasting impact on who I became, though I would still give anything to have him back with us today.
Growing up, the highlight of my life was the time spent fishing with my 2 older brothers. We lived in a remote rural area where the woods felt endless, and we would often spend our days hiking. Through the thick brush, we found various hidden creeks. Our success in terms of actual fish was usually minimal. The creeks rarely yielded anything of significant size. However, the catch was never the true point of the excursion. The real value lay in the silent camaraderie of sitting by the water with my brothers, passing the hours in the stillness of the trees. We followed the classic tradition of waking up long before the sun had risen. Our treks would begin in the cool, gray pre-dawn as we watched the light slowly steal across the sky and filter through the canopy. By the time we reached our chosen destination, the world would be fully bright. The morning dew would be clinging to our boots. It was a peaceful routine that defined our summers. The most frightening experience we ever had occurred on a day when we decided to be more adventurous than usual. We set out that morning with a collective determination to push further into the hills than we had ever gone before. We bypassed our familiar, reliable spots and kept walking until the woods grew denser and the air felt heavier. Eventually, we stumbled upon a location that seemed perfect. The surrounding forest was thick and ancient, but the creek itself was unexpectedly wide and deep. A large fallen tree stretched across the water like a natural bridge, adding to the beauty. After testing the trunk to ensure it was sturdy enough to hold our weight, the 3 of us carefully balanced our way across to the far bank. We spread out our gear and began to fish, hopeful for better luck. As the afternoon wore on, however, the fish remained elusive. The heat of the day began to set in, and the repetitive casting of lines grew tedious. Given how deep and inviting the water looked, we broke our usual rules. We set our fishing poles aside on the bank and jumped into the creek to go swimming. We had been splashing around for quite a while when I noticed a sudden shift in the atmosphere. My middle brother had stopped moving entirely and was staring intently into the dark tree line. When our oldest brother asked what was bothering him, he simply gestured toward the shadows of the woods. He whispered that someone was out there watching us from the cover of the trees. My initial thought was that we had encountered some local creep, but as I followed his pointing finger, that suspicion turned into sharp fear. Standing among the trees was an imposing large man. Despite the shade, we could make out his appearance quite clearly. He was dressed in jeans and a heavy flannel shirt, which seemed strangely out of place given the warmth. A baseball cap was pulled low over his brow, obscuring much of his face. The most terrifying detail, however, was the long firearm. Either a rifle or a shotgun that he held firmly in his hands. A heavy silence fell over us as we tried to decide what to do. We were well aware that by wandering this far, we were almost certainly trespassing. We never knew exactly where the property lines were. We knew this land didn't belong to us. Up until that moment, we had never faced any consequences for our wandering. My middle brother and I looked to our oldest brother for a plan, but he looked shaken. He offered no immediate direction, choosing instead to keep his eyes locked on the armed man. Eventually, our oldest brother suggested that we should try to navigate back to the bank, grab our gear and retreat. The problem was that our clothes and poles were on the same side of the creek where the man was standing. We began to move slowly through the water toward the shore, trying to remain calm, before we could reach the bank. However, an elderly woman suddenly burst from the undergrowth. She was shrieking with a high, piercing intensity that sounded like a banshee. The sudden noise startled me so badly that I slipped. I fell backward into the deep water, struggling until my middle brother grabbed my arm and pulled me back to the surface. The woman was disheveled and frantic as she ran straight for our pile of belongings. She began grabbing our fishing poles and clothes, clutching them to her chest while shouting that everything now belonged to her. She gathered the items in a desperate heap, dropping small pieces of gear as she managed the armful. Our oldest brother shouted for her to stop and tried to move faster toward the shore to reclaim our property. However, our middle brother reached out and stopped him, pointing back toward the large man in the flannel shirt. The man had moved closer to the water's edge as we approached the shore. He raised his gun and leveled it in our direction as he walked. I remember yelling out in terror while my middle brother apologized. He told them we were sorry for trespassing on their land. The pair ignored our pleas entirely. Our oldest brother, driven by a mix of frustration and bravado, muttered that he didn't think the man would actually shoot. He tried to take another step toward the woman to get our shoes and shirts back. The moment he moved, the woman's demeanor shifted from frantic to aggressive. She pulled a fillet knife from her pocket. She began waving it wildly at him, screaming that she would cut him if he came any closer. By this point, the large man had reached the very edge of the creek. He cocked the shotgun with a heavy mechanical click and pointed it directly at my oldest brother's chest. That sound was enough to make him freeze instantly in his tracks. It was a terrifying, tense standoff. We stood chest deep in the cold water, shivering as we stared down the barrel of a gun. Once the woman had finished scavenging every bit of our gear and clothing, the man spoke a single, gravelly word. He told us to get out. We didn't wait for a second invitation. All three of us turned and swam desperately for the opposite bank. We scrambled out of the water and began running into the woods. The journey home was miserable. We had to hike several miles through the dense forest wearing nothing but our soaking wet shorts. We were completely barefoot, and every twig, sharp rock, and dried leaf stung our feet. Despite the pain, we were far too frightened to even think about looking back or slowing down. When we finally made it home and explained why we had returned empty-handed, our father surprisingly didn't scold us. He simply told us that there are dangerous, unstable people living deep in the woods, and that we had to be more careful. It was a very long time before any of us felt brave again.
It is a chilling realization to look back at an evening and see exactly where the warning signs were ignored. A few months ago, a date began with a nagging sense of familiarity that could not be placed. The assumption was that the encounter had happened on a random night out, and because it was a last-minute arrangement, the expectations were kept low. A clear boundary was set early on. There was no desire for a serious relationship, only a casual hangout. In hindsight, that was the first mistake in a series of events that quickly spiraled into a nightmare. The man seemed decent enough at first, but his demeanor shifted the moment they arrived at the restaurant. While he declined to order food, he immediately began making forward comments about her body and curves. Though she tried to laugh it off to ease the tension, his bluntness felt inappropriate and aggressive. As she ate, the conversation took a turn toward the nice guy trope. He lamented about how other women never gave men like him a chance, which sent immediate red flags through her mind. Sensing danger, she fabricated a story about needing to head home early to dog-sit for her parents. He appeared to believe the excuse, but his behavior only grew more predatory. He spent the meal staring at her chest and pressured her for suggestive photos. When she expressed her discomfort and told him she didn't engage in that behavior, he briefly stopped, only to produce a strange set of gifts from his bag. He presented a bouquet of roses and, inexplicably, a bag of prawns from Tesco. Her confusion turned to genuine fear when he explained the gift. He claimed to know she loved prawns and tempura. The problem was that she had never mentioned her food preferences to him. The urge to run was overwhelming, yet the social pressure not to be rude kept her in her seat for the remaining hour. As the clock ticked down, he began reciting intimate details of her life, with terrifying accuracy. He knew which school she had attended, her personality traits as a child, and her current professional situation. When she finally demanded to know how he possessed this information, he revealed a disturbing level of premeditation. His mother had been one of her former teachers, and he had interrogated her for details while scouring the internet for anything else he could find. A timely text from her mother provided a temporary lifeline. She used the notification as an excuse to end the date, claiming her parents had mixed up the schedule and she needed to leave immediately. The man accepted this, but insisted on walking her home. She attempted to compromise by suggesting he only walk her halfway, as she wasn't comfortable revealing her address. It was then that he dropped another bombshell. He already knew which road she lived on, though he claimed not to know the specific house number. When she called out how creepy and weird his knowledge was, he lied and claimed she had told him herself. For her own safety, she tried to steer them toward a well-lit main road, but he grabbed her hand and forced her toward a dark shortcut. Despite her protests, he dragged her onto a deserted street. In the shadows, he suddenly forced himself on her, shoving his tongue down her throat. She managed to push him away, and the sight of a distant stranger walking a dog provided enough of a distraction for her to bolt back toward the main road. Even then, he refused to leave. He continued to follow her until she stopped and tried to bid him a final polite farewell, mentioning it was nice to meet him again. At that point, the truth of their familiarity came out. He admitted they had never actually met before. He had simply lied about a previous encounter to trick her into meeting him. As she tried to walk away, he grabbed her again, pulling her towards some bushes while claiming there was one more thing he needed to do. The physical struggle intensified as he tightened his grip, his fingers digging into the soft skin of her arm with a strength that made her breath hitch. She tried to twist away, but he used his body weight to pin her closer to the rustling leaves of the overgrown hedge, the rough branches catching in her hair. Every time she tried to speak, he leaned in further, his shadow completely engulfing her as he ignored her repeated pleas to be left alone. The air felt heavy and cold as she realized he wasn't just being pushy. He was actively trying to overpower her in the dark, secluded space. She felt a wave of nausea hit as he whispered about how it would only take a moment, his eyes darting around to ensure they were still hidden from the streetlights. The situation turned violent as he squeezed her wrist hard enough to cause pain, pulling her back for another forced kiss. He explicitly suggested they use the bushes for privacy, and though she screamed no and fought back, he continued to drag her toward the brush, promising it would only take a second. It was only the appearance of more dog walkers that caused him to hesitate. He took one last opportunity to assault her by grabbing her breast before she finally broke free and ran. Her heart pounded against her ribs as she fled, terrified that he was right behind her. She took a long, circuitous route home to ensure she wasn't being followed. Once inside the safety of her house, she collapsed into tears. The horror reached its peak when a message arrived on her phone from a different account. It was him describing the evening as the best date ever and calling her the prettiest girl he'd ever kissed. He signed off by calling himself a gentleman and mentioning that he was currently standing on her road. She sank to the floor, paralyzed by the realization of her proximity to him. Looking closer at his profile, the memory finally clicked. Years earlier, this same man had plagued her old Facebook account with disturbing messages and creepy, edited photos, professing his love. The entire terrifying ordeal, from the first greeting to the final threat, had lasted only 90 minutes, but the impact would last much longer.
A few months ago, I decided that I was finally ready to move on from the breakup I had experienced during the previous summer. My relationship with my long-term girlfriend had ended, and it had taken me a significant amount of time to process the heartbreak. However, there eventually comes a point where a person simply has to get back out there and try again. I made the decision to download the dating app Hinge and began the process of looking through various profiles. In my experience, it felt like the most effective app available because it allowed for direct messaging. This feature meant I didn't have to sit around hoping for a mutual match before starting a conversation. It gave me a much better opportunity to talk to the specific kind of women I found attractive. One of those women was a Persian girl named Sarosh. Tsuroshi was truly one of the most beautiful people I had ever seen. She had a striking mane of dark, wild hair that was dip-dyed blonde at the tips. Her features were very defined, with high cheekbones and perfectly shaped eyebrows. Her eyes were perhaps her most captivating feature, being a deep, dark brown that seemed very alluring. She was absolutely stunning. I felt like I had a bit of a competitive advantage because she had grown up in Tehran, the capital of Iran, and I happened to speak a small amount of Farsi. I thought that mentioning my knowledge of her native language might impress her, and it turned out that I was right. Within about an hour of sending my opening message, we were having a great conversation. She seemed to be an incredibly busy individual, so I felt quite flattered when she told me she would clear some time in her schedule to meet me. We eventually made arrangements to get coffee over the upcoming weekend. When the day of the date arrived, she showed up wearing her gym clothes. She was very quick to apologize for her casual appearance, explaining that she had just finished a session with her personal trainer and didn't have time to change. Her outfit didn't bother me in the least. She looked incredible in her yoga pants. We sat down with our coffees and began the typical first date ritual of discussing our lives, our jobs, and our various interests. While we were talking, I happened to look out of the large glass windows of the cafe. I noticed a man leaning against a car outside. At first, I assumed my mind was just playing tricks on me or that I was being paranoid, but after watching him for a minute or two, I realized he was staring directly at us without blinking. Tsuroshi eventually noticed that my attention was drifting over her shoulder. She asked me what I was looking at, and I mentioned a man outside who seemed to be staring us down quite intensely. She turned around to see for herself, but she spun back toward me almost instantly. The look on her face was one of pure terror. She urgently told me that we needed to leave the shop right that second. I asked her why and if she knew the man, but she denied knowing who he was. Despite her denial, I wasn't naive. I understood the situation immediately. It was obvious that this was either a very controlling family member or a dangerous ex-boyfriend. I initially assumed that the man would just follow us for a bit to try and act intimidating, but I never could have imagined that he would actually get physical with me. The way he eventually attacked me was terrifying. The city where I live is built up along a very wide river, and the coffee shop we had chosen was located right on the docks. As we started walking along the city's promenade, the man suddenly cornered me. He grabbed me tightly by the throat and began shoving me backward with a lot of force. Before I knew it, my back was pressed against the railings of the walkway, and I was leaning out over the water. I tried my best to pry his hands off of me, but the man was incredibly large and strong. No matter how hard I struggled, I couldn't break his grip. The river in my city is notorious for having an extremely powerful current. It is common knowledge that if someone falls into the water from a boat or the side of the promenade, they are in grave danger. The current is strong enough to pull a person under, drown them, and sweep them out into the Irish Sea in a very short amount of time. While he held me there, he began shouting threats at me. He told me in a very aggressive, macho way that I needed to leave Tsuroshi alone and stay away from her. During the struggle, Tsuroshi was hitting him on the head and screaming at him to let me go. All I could think about in that moment was that if I went over those railings and into the water, I was a dead man. I honestly don't think the man realized how dangerous the river was. Based on his voice, he didn't have the local accent, so he wasn't from our city. He probably thought he could just toss me into the water to embarrass me or scare me off, assuming I would be able to swim to safety. I knew for a fact that wouldn't have been the case. If he had pushed me, he would have ended up facing a manslaughter charge. Fortunately, he didn't follow through with throwing me over. After he had yelled and vented some of his anger, he finally let go of my throat. He backed away from us and started walking back in the direction he had originally come from. I can acknowledge that Tsuroshi was a gorgeous woman, and I can understand why a guy might feel bitter or jealous after a breakup. However, the level of aggression he showed was insane. If he had been just a little bit angrier, or if he had completely lost his temper, I wouldn't be around to tell this story. I would likely be floating somewhere in the middle of the Irish Sea, or perhaps washing up on a beach in County Cork as a corpse. It is a frightening thought to realize my life was nearly ended just because someone couldn't handle their jealousy.
For reference, I am a 27-year-old female and this story takes place 10 years ago when I was 17. I had just started university and was excited about having a fresh new start, since I'd always been a nerdy outcast in high school. I had never had a boyfriend before. I'd never even been on a date, so I was naive and optimistic about boys. My introverted and awkward personality hadn't magically changed since entering university, so it's safe to say that I didn't meet any interesting guys at school. One late night, I was in my room working on an assignment on my laptop when I received a request on MSN Messenger. The email address was a boy's name with some numbers. The name was clearly ethnic and likely someone of the same origin as mine. Intrigued, I accepted. For the sake of the story, we'll call the boy Ken. We got chatting, and I asked him how he had gotten my email address. He dodged the question. I let it go, not thinking too much into it. This was from a time when it was normal to accept anyone and everyone as a friend on Facebook, as well as other social media platforms. As Ken and I continued to talk, I learned that he lived in my city and, apparently, wasn't much older than me. As I guessed, our roots were, in fact, in the same country, the motherland. I asked him why he didn't have a picture of himself on his display picture, and this prompted him to suggest that we turn on our webcams because he wanted to see me too. I declined, but he insisted. Somehow, he convinced me, and we both switched on our webcams. I was pleasantly surprised and somewhat relieved to see that Ken was a good-looking young guy, chatting to me from the comfort of his bedroom, seemingly very normal. Our MSN chats carried on for a few weeks. They developed into texts, and we even had a few phone calls after I had agreed to give him my phone number. I started to develop a crush on Ken. He asked me to go out with him a few times, but I was always pretty busy with school, and our schedules weren't lining up. Finally, we found one afternoon when we were both free and decided to schedule a lunch date. Ken had a car and had offered to pick me up from my university after I was done for the day. I was a little too dressed up for my C++ programming class, but just right for the lunch date we had planned at the local vegetarian restaurant. Stupidly, I didn't tell any of my friends where I was going or with whom, because I was embarrassed about going on my very first date at almost age 18 with someone who had randomly added me on MSNA. I waited outside my building when a black car with heavily tinted windows pulled up beside me. The passenger side window rolled down, and sure enough, there was Ken sitting in the driver's seat. I was happy to see that he was just as cute in person as he was on webcam. However, what I wasn't expecting was the intense smell of weed floating out the car. Not relevant, but it is part of the first impression. Admittedly, I was a bit taken aback and was concerned that he might be driving high. He unlocked the doors and motioned for me to get in, so I did without dispute. As I sat down in the passenger seat, he started acting overly familiar in a way that made me uncomfortable. "So," I started, "do you know where the restaurant is? I can guide you if you want." He smirked at me, but didn't say anything and just started driving. Okay, kind of weird. I thought maybe I was just nervous or awkward, both of which I could sympathize with, so I let it be. I was about to try my hand at a little small talk, which I'm no good at, when I noticed him heading towards the highway ramp. I started to worry because the restaurant was not far from my campus, and there was no reason for us to be getting the highway. You don't need to get the highway. The restaurant's actually really nearby. I can guide you. I tried to keep my voice steady, but I could hear my own nervousness. Ken finally spoke for the first time since I'd gotten in the car, suggested changing plans and going somewhere more private instead. We can play Need for Speed, and I can make you lunch. I realized I was putting myself in a risky situation with someone I barely knew for the first time, and I hadn't told anyone where I was going. My mind was racing. I knew that this would be an utterly stupid thing to do, and despite the clear red flags waving in my face, I decided that I didn't want to ruin our first date by rejecting his offer to make me lunch and play Need for Speed together, which I told him I liked playing. Don't judge me. So, like an idiot, I reluctantly agreed to avoid being rude. We made it to his house. It was apparently his family's home, and was situated in a sort of shady neighborhood. We stepped inside, and of course, no one was home except us. It was sparsely furnished and looked unkept, which struck me as pretty odd for a family home. He informed me that his Xbox was in his bedroom. I hesitated in the doorway, but he sat at the foot of his bed in front of the TV and patted the empty space beside him for me to have a seat. There was literally nowhere else to sit in this room, so I cautiously sat down, keeping as much distance as I could between us. I started to relax as we played Need for Speed, and he made us peanut butter and jellies to munch on. I was about to laugh at myself for being overly paranoid when Ken did something bizarre. He got up onto the bed and sat uncomfortably close behind me, invading my personal space, an extremely awkward position, and tried to guide my hands on the controller. I started to ask him what he was doing, and as if this wasn't uncomfortable enough, his behavior suddenly crossed a clear personal boundary. That is when I really started to panic. I thought he was going to try and grope my chest, but instead he started squeezing, and he continued acting in a way that made me feel uneasy and unsafe. I was more than a little chubby back then. Freshman, and then some, so you can imagine what that might have been like. I dropped the controller in pure shock and quickly stood up, fixing my shirt. I was at a loss for words, and he did nothing but smirk at me until he reacted in a way that made the situation even more uncomfortable. I felt completely disgusted and violated. I'd had enough. I lied and told him that I had a group project to work on and needed to go. He asked where I lived so that he could drop me home. Thankfully, I had the common sense to not tell him and ask him to drop me back at school instead, where I would be supposedly meeting my classmates, and he obliged. After our very uncomfortable first date, I decided I didn't want to talk to Ken anymore. I didn't block him on MSN or my phone, our only two methods of communication, but I rarely responded to his messages, and I ignored all of his calls. Once he messaged me on MSN at around 11 p.m. asking me to come over and telling me that he would send a cab to bring me over to his place. Thoroughly annoyed, I responded, "What do you take me for? Why do you even think I would want to go to that?" He replied saying that it was nothing dirty and that he promised. It was just bizarre. I was disgusted and didn't even reply. He continued trying to get in touch with me for months and then suddenly vanished. I figured he'd finally gotten the point. Now, I wish this story ended here, but it doesn't. I last heard from Ken in late February. He had stopped trying to contact me shortly after Valentine's Day. In April, 2 nuclear family members and I went on a holiday to visit another relative called Annie, who was living in the Caribbean at the time. Annie, who I love dearly, was and still is a bit of an eccentric. She considers herself very spiritual and is an active member of a large, well-known spiritual organization. She is deeply connected with the motherland, more than the rest of us are, and goes back for frequent visits. While we stayed with her in the Caribbean, she told us about her most recent trip to the motherland, where she met a wealthy and well-connected local woman through the organization, who quickly became a very close friend. Connie, the con artist. During our visit, Anne introduced us to Connie virtually over Skype, because Connie lived in the motherland. We chatted to her a few times throughout our vacation by Skype, and got to know her a little bit. Little did we know back then that Connie, whom Annie had spontaneously met halfway across the world in the motherland, would soon wreak utter havoc on our lives. Now, that's a story that I'm just not ready to tell, and perhaps may never be, because of how many lives were affected, and the severity of the damage that had been inflicted. What you need to know is that Connie was an outright criminal and con artist who had been targeting our family from long before Annie had actually met her. Their meeting was no coincidence. Not only did she manage to steal over $100,000 from our family, but she took any peace of mind or sense of security we had with it. When we finally caught on and confronted her, she insisted that we were mistaken, but disappeared into thin air once we forced her out of our lives. You're probably wondering what on earth this has to do with the story about Ken. Well, get this. The situation with Connie lasted many months. The whole thing is kind of a blur to me now, but as we spoke to her online in April, I remember the whole ordeal lasting well into the fall. While she normally resided in the motherland, Annie had invited her to visit and stay with us, where we, my whole family and I presently live. That's when things really took a turn for the worst. Some of the things I clearly remember, and are important to this story, were that one. The whole time she was staying with us, she was trying to convince me to transfer schools to a very obscure school and program in the US. I don't even live in the US and was actually getting very pushy about it. And two, she had asked me very personal and inappropriate questions and made uncomfortable comments about my personal life and future. Disturbing, I know. During this time, I was so emotionally drained and stressed that I didn't really think of anything but the situation at hand. In fact, I had stopped socializing almost entirely and even started habitually skipping classes. I had lost contact with my high school friends, and my university friends were too new to really care, so my strange behavior and new destructive habits went unnoticed. Fast forward one day after Connie's final disappearance in the fall. I was home with my dad when my cell phone rang. I looked at the caller ID, and it was a number I didn't have saved, so it was showing the contact information as whatever name the phone was registered under. My heart dropped to my stomach. My phone displayed a name. The first name was a man's name, and the last name was the same last name as Connie's. I began to panic, and I ran into my bedroom to answer the call. I had no idea what to expect, and when I answered the phone, I was greeted with a familiar voice. It was Ken. I honestly thought I was going to puke when I suddenly came to a realization that he had been a part of this whole sick plot. Of course, I don't have hard evidence to prove that he was connected to Connie, but let me explain. The timing of his appearance and reappearance into my life, the last name, a fairly unique surname originating from the part of the motherland where Connie is from. And I had never known Ken's last name until then. And the fact that he contacted me out of the blue, I had no idea why or how. It was all just too bizarre to be a mere coincidence. Of course, I freaked out at Ken when he called me, and I told him that if he ever called me again, I would call the police. His response was just a weird, dry half laugh, and then he said, "Well, okay then," in the most creepy voice you can think of, and hung up. I knew in my gut that that was their last attempt to get back in touch and somehow slither their way back into mine and my family's lives. Thankfully, I never heard from Ken again after that day. A while after all of this ended, I was having a conversation with a family member who was also closely involved in all of this, about the whole ordeal. And she told me she'd sensed something extremely wrong with Connie. She was pushing to have me sent off to the US to that obscure school, and she had an unshakable feeling that Connie was involved in some sort of trafficking scene, and that if I left, she would never see me again. The horrifying pieces came together, and I was just too damn naive to have seen it before. The memories flooded back to me when I heard that. How Ken told me, nothing dirty, I promise, when he invited me over, and how Connie was telling me to remain a virgin. As I said, I had never told a soul about Ken, nor about the weird V-card conversation with Connie. I strongly and firmly believe that Ken had been a sort of player in Connie's game, and was just there to keep me away from guys, and prevent me from having a boyfriend. For those of you wondering why we never called the police on Connie nor Ken, because nothing illegal ever happened at face value. It's a bit hard to explain. I'll also mention that I tried to find Ken online many times after everything ended. I don't know why. Perhaps I felt like I wanted to expose him, or call him out, and wasn't able to find a sliver of information on him. Not by the name Ken, nor by the name on the caller ID. It was as if he never existed. Also, from this incident onwards, I can't stomach a lot of these spiritual organizations. I never liked the idea to begin with, but now I've truly experienced how they can both attract the vulnerable and unsavory who are looking for someone vulnerable to prey on. No judgments to those who are into those sort of things. It just isn't for me personally. I would like to hear what you guys think of this. Do you think my suspicions are plausible? What do you make of Ken and Annie? And to you both, I hope you rot in hell. In early 2019, as a 16-year-old living in the UK, I agreed to a semi-blind date with a 19-year-old named Cameron. We had been introduced through a mutual friend and had seen photos of one another beforehand. To all outward appearances, Cameron seemed like a perfectly ordinary person. He enjoyed video games and anime, and nothing in his background suggested anything unusual or alarming. After exchanging numbers and texting for a single evening, we decided to meet the following day at a local Starbucks. Although I typically prefer to wait longer before meeting someone in person, I felt a sense of security knowing we shared a trusted friend. I arrived at the coffee shop slightly ahead of schedule. Following my usual habit of buying my own drink to avoid any sense of obligation, I ordered a coffee and found a seat facing away from the entrance. I spent about 15 minutes relaxing with a book until a text arrived from Cameron announcing his arrival. I messaged him back to indicate which table I was sitting at. Almost immediately, I felt someone standing directly behind me. As I began to turn my head to acknowledge him, he suddenly pressed his lips against my neck and began to suck on my skin before I could even utter a greeting. The gesture was incredibly invasive. I have always been deeply uncomfortable with anyone touching my neck due to being extremely ticklish. Even professional massages or hair treatments feel like an ordeal to me. To make matters worse, he had a heavy, unpleasant scent that reminded me of old dust. Startled and overwhelmed, I instinctively elbowed him in the chest to force him away. When he finally let go, he stared at me with an unsettling expression and gave a flat, deadpan laugh. The situation felt increasingly eerie. When I demanded an explanation for his behavior, he simply brushed it off by claiming he thought the gesture was cute. Despite my rising alarm, I tried to convince myself that first impressions could be misleading and that I should still attempt to have a conversation. However, he spent the duration of our talk staring inappropriately at my chest. He made a crude, direct comment, expressing surprise at my physical appearance based on my ethnicity, and stated his intention to keep me around. At that point, my discomfort turned into genuine fear. The vibes he was giving off were so predatory that I didn't feel safe simply standing up and walking out the front door. I retreated to the ladies' bathroom and waited for another woman to enter. Once someone arrived, I explained my situation and asked if she could help me leave without being spotted, as I was terrified he might try to follow me home. The woman was incredibly kind and agreed to help, even lending me her hat and scarf to mask my appearance. Under the cover of the winter accessories and the crowded room, we walked out together. She successfully helped me slip out through the Starbucks back exit without him noticing my departure. Afterward, he reached out to our mutual friend to ask where I had gone, but I instructed my friend never to mention me to him again. While I sometimes feel guilty for not ending the date more formally, the fear I felt in that moment was overwhelming. It was a disturbing experience that I hope never to repeat.
I have reactive attachment disorder, and as a result, I struggle with severe depression. However, I don't take any medication. I say that because I was going through one of the worst bouts of depression I had suffered in a year and a half. And I wasn't hallucinating because of the medication. It was Tuesday night or Wednesday morning, October 13th to 14th. I had cried myself to sleep like I had done for however many hours before. When I woke up, it was 3:34 a.m. My cat Betty was walking around on the bed, and for some reason, my alarm on my phone was going off. I used the Sleep Cycle app, and the alarm was going off even though I had set it for 5:30 to 6 a.m. So I am frustrated that it decided to stop working correctly. Then, I hear that my computer in the living room turns on. I thought that my other cat Vader must have knocked the mouse while wailing over the desk. Then I see the light turn on from the monitor. What? I thought. I was kind of pissed, so I started grumbling about the cats walking around, alarms going off unreasonably, and Vader knocking things about. Until I turned on the bedside lamp and saw both cats are lying at the end of my bed. Looking into my living room, I froze. I was so confused. I was trying to make sense of it when I heard my main door open. Like the screen door first, then the front doorknob. Then I heard someone move across the carpet. Unlike the movies, I jumped out of bed as quietly as possible, wondering how the hell was someone entering my apartment, as I sure as hell locked the front door to the apartment. I silently stepped into the hall and peeked around the corner. My cats nonchalantly decided to ignore the obvious home invader, thief, or murderer that had entered our home. I looked around the corner, and the door was closed. The lights were off, the monitor was off, but I could hear the computer running. I stood there frozen and listened for any noise for God knows how long. But I could not make sense of it at all and couldn't sleep the whole night. It wasn't a dream. Maybe I was sleepwalking. I don't know. But I have never been afraid of my apartment, and at that very moment, I felt very afraid. Very much alone. It hasn't happened again. Or maybe it has. I just don't know.
Illegal activities in the club. In a bustling American city, there was a lively place called Five Nights at Freddy's Club. It seemed like a fun and harmless spot for young people. The club had vibrant lights and music that attracted crowds looking to have a good time, dance, and make lasting memories. The atmosphere was filled with excitement as people embraced the carefree spirit of the night. However, hidden beneath the lively exterior, there was a secret side to Five Nights at Freddy's Club that the partygoers didn't know about. Behind the scenes, there were rumors of hidden activities that the revelers were unaware of. While the neon lights and energetic music created a lively atmosphere, there was a mysterious world behind it, keeping the patrons blissfully ignorant of the secrets hidden in the heart of Five Nights at Freddy's Club. One day, a reporter named Alex Thompson heard rumors about something bad happening at the club. People were saying that illegal drugs were being given to the partygoers without them knowing. Interested in uncovering the truth, Alex decided to go undercover to expose what was going on. Alex brought a hidden camera and a strong belief in doing what's right. Acting like any other person there to have a good time, Alex joined the lively crowd at the club. The place was full of energy, with bright lights and loud music making the dance floor come alive. As Alex moved through the crowded dance floor, it became clear that there was a challenge ahead. The club had tight security, with alert bouncers strategically placed to discourage unwanted attention. Despite this, Alex stayed determined, carefully watching the subtle interactions and whispered conversations among the partygoers. Weeks went by as Alex kept diving into the club scene, trying to collect proof to reveal the illegal drug trade. The nights started to blend, and frustration grew as every attempt to capture the illegal activities on camera failed. The drug deals were done secretly, and those involved were skilled at avoiding detection. But Alex didn't give up. Every obstacle only made Alex more determined to uncover the truth and shield the unsuspecting youth from the dangers hidden in Freddy's Club's shadow. One late night, as the music thumped to its peak, Alex had a breakthrough. In that club, there was a special room that only allowed rich and VIP guests. Security guards stood outside the room, making it impossible for an ordinary person to enter. For some reason, Alex found this strange and thought about listening to the activities and communication inside the room. However, the security was so tight that entering was completely impossible. Because of this, Alex came up with a plan. He decided to work as a waiter in the club to try to enter the room, but this plan failed because only appointed waiters were allowed inside. So, with the help of the club's gossip queen manager, Elizabeth, Alex thought of a way to get inside. After spending some time impressing Elizabeth, Alex finally got permission to be an appointed waiter. This way, he got the opportunity to enter the special room. The scene inside the room was quite surprising. Everyone there was discussing drugs and collaborating with the drug dealer. Alex recorded the whole incident with his mobile camera. Not only that, there was another incident in a corner. A group of people appeared to be involved in a suspicious transaction. Alex quietly approached, recording the exchange with the hidden camera. Finally, There was evidence. The footage showed young faces swapping small packages, exposing the unsettling truth beneath the surface of the lively celebration. Now that Alex had the evidence, it was time to reveal the story. Working hard to safeguard the identities of the innocent young people involved, Alex put together a powerful report. The report would expose the drug trade while ensuring the anonymity of those unintentionally caught up in the deceit. But this journey was not so easy. Bringing the truth of the 5 Nights at Freddy's Club to light was no walk in the park. When Alex tried to leave the club with the evidence, he was caught by the manager, Elizabeth, who had overheard the hidden conversation of the drug dealer. As a result, security guards were called, and Alex was taken into a room and beaten. However, Alex didn't lose courage. Somehow struggling with a security guard, he managed to escape from the room and, overcoming great difficulties, exited the club safely, saving himself from potential harm. As soon as he got outside, he took a deep breath and wasted no time. Alex immediately went to the police station. Once there, he showed the police all the evidence of the illegal activities happening in the club that he had captured on his camera. He also informed them about the assault he faced. Listening to his story and seeing the evidence, the police were quite surprised. They registered a First Information Report, FIR, based on his account and the evidence provided. When the story came out, it had a significant impact on the community. The revelation of drug activities in the beloved club caused shock, worry, and demands for quick action. 5 Nights at Freddy's Club, once a symbol of youthful joy, was now tainted by the shadow of illegal activities. Because of public outrage and the growing evidence, the police acted quickly. They closed down the club and started legal proceedings against those involved in selling drugs. The shutdown of the club sent a strong message to other places that might be doing similar illegal activities. The city, now understanding the risks in seemingly harmless locations, started taking measures to keep its young people safe. The incident led to a wider discussion about the importance of having better security in clubs and being more careful to prevent illegal activities from getting into places meant for fun and friendship. Alex's courage in going undercover not only revealed the truth, but also brought about positive changes in the community. As the city recovered from the shock of Freddy's Club's hidden secret, its people promised to stay watchful, making sure that hidden dangers wouldn't endanger their youth again. After everything settled, Alex thought about how investigative journalism could reveal things that some wanted to keep in the dark. The story of Freddy's Club showed that, even amid celebration, there could be hidden problems, waiting to be uncovered by those willing to find the truth.
No matter how much I wish it wasn't the case, I must insist that this story is completely true. I was not drunk, nor was I under the influence of any drugs. Neither was my friend. I truly fear his state of mind might have been permanently altered due to his terrifying experience with these beings. Secondly, I like to consider myself a rational thinking type of person, with years of experience hunting and hiking. I have seen all kinds of local fauna and flora throughout my life, so I'm confident that I did not confuse what I saw for something entirely different or common to the area. It all started then. I went to a friend's house to celebrate his birthday. He was turning 18, and I was already 18 myself. His uncle, a man even more native to the land than myself, was 27. We can call him James. I finally arrived at his house at about 4 p.m. that night, on January 25th. Since he effectively lived in the middle of nowhere at the foothills of the Rockies, I was keen on bringing something with me, in case I ran into some trouble like a bear or a mountain lion. So I brought along my .357 Magnum and some binoculars, just in case my friend wanted to try and hunt some coyotes with his rifle. We started doing our normal routine for most of the day, which included playing games on his computer, watching some TV, and just chilling out while talking about school. And his parents were away on a business trip. They had left James and his uncle the house to themselves. The thing that James loved the most in the world was easily his dogs. He had 2 chocolate labs and a golden retriever. The retriever was fairly old. This being Wyoming, where people do not really give a hoot about strict leashes, the dogs were left out all day. They came and went as they pleased back to his house. Sometime around 8 or 9 p.m., we heard his dogs begin barking at something off in the distance. At this point, the sun was long gone, but the full moon provided an amazing amount of light against the winter landscape. I looked through the window. Even with the moon shining brightly against the white snow, I could not see anything up to the tree line that was nearly a mile away. I told James that there was nothing out there. James whispered back. He asked if I was sure, and noted that the dogs did not even bark at deer anymore. The whole situation felt very weird. Fast forward an hour, and his dogs had not been heard or seen since. His uncle was buzzed and watching something on their huge TV, but James was beginning to worry that something had happened to his dogs. Now, wolves can still be very dangerous in the Rockies and take down dogs. This was the moment where I started to get anxious, partly because he wanted to get his dogs back, and partly because wolves sometimes kill sheep, or even cows. If they were desperate, they would take us. Even still, those dogs were his family, so we grabbed our guns and we headed outside. We were armed with heavy clothing, as well as my .357, the binoculars, and his .223 rifle. We braced ourselves and headed out. In the Wyoming winter, with temperatures reaching 20 degrees below freezing, we went in the direction of where we last saw his dogs. The whole time we walked toward the tree line, my veins were flooded with adrenaline. It was the same feeling I got every time I hunted, but tonight, we definitely were not the hunters. We were about 300 yards away from the tree line when James suddenly stopped. I almost ran into him. He just stared at the tree line. He kept whispering for me to look at the trees. Slowly, he raised his left index finger towards the foothills of the mountains. He readied his rifle and pointed it towards them. I noticed at this point that his breathing was extremely rapid and raspy, like he had just witnessed a fatal car crash right in front of him. At that point, I honestly did not know what he saw. I scanned the tree line over and over. I crouched down to sit on the snow and used the binoculars towards where he pointed. It took me about 30 seconds, but eventually I saw what scared him. There was something out there, and it was not human, and it was not his dogs. Something on 4 legs came out from behind a tree at the edge of the forest. It was 3 feet tall. At first I assumed it was a wolf, or maybe even a small bear. A few seconds later, several more of these things came out of the woods. I did not pause to try and count them exactly. There were at least 6 or 7, and who knows how many more were still hiding in the trees. We watched them slowly walk out of the trees for several minutes. These animals seemed strangely cautious and slow. Then they eventually stopped as a howl from a dog or wolf came out from behind us. It was far enough away for us to not worry, but close enough for the unknown animals out there to hear. I looked back through the binoculars and could almost make out the general texture of these creatures. They were now about 275 yards away. They looked pale and thin. They still appeared to be like wolves. My heart began to race when I saw what they did next. These things, whatever they were, picked up their pace fast, reaching speeds of what looked like 15 to 20 miles per hour, closing the distance. This was almost right at us. After a minute or so, James lost his nerve and tried to run away. I grabbed him and threw him on the ground as he started to run, but this caught them. The beasts stopped. James and I, frozen with fear, sat down in the snow with our weapons ready. I almost lost it as well when I noticed that the eyes of these things reflected the moonlight. They were orange in color. They did not really glow like in some stories of cryptids. They were more piercing and reflective. We stared at them, and they stared back at us for what seemed like hours. Then one of these creatures stood up on its back legs. At this moment, all of my knowledge on hunting and animals was rendered meaningless. I knew some animals could stand, but never for very long. I audibly counted to see how long it stayed like that. 5 seconds, 10, 15. Then James screamed and pointed his .223 to the right. I looked and saw a creature on the left begin to run. Dumbfounded, I turned my attention to the rest of them and told James to keep watching the one that ran away. I did a quick count of the ones that remained. The the ones staring us down. There were only 4. My heart pounded out of my chest because there was no way we could have lost something so large on these plains. They are completely flat and covered in snow. I saw it. It was crouched down and trying not to be seen. I realized how smart these things were, much smarter than I would have ever expected. These things were flanking us, I whispered to James, my suspicion. He confirmed he had the same thought. I made up a quick plan in my head and relayed the best course of action to James. I told him to start backing away slowly while maintaining eye contact. As soon as I finished telling him my idea, I did another quick count. Now there were only 3 pairs of orange eyes. Another one had gone somewhere. The one that first stood was walking towards us. I helped James up and told him to keep an eye on our right side while I looked to the left. We backed away, but these beasts walked with us, maintaining their distance the whole time. Eventually, we were only about 100 yards from his house before we turned and ran to his front door. We booked it towards his porch lights, no longer caring to be coy about the situation. Foolishly, I stopped 50 feet short of the porch and turned around. Maybe it was curiosity, but I regretted it the moment I did it. My body seized up the moment I saw it. Those creatures stopped. With the creatures ever so slightly illuminated by the porch lights, I realized that these things seemed otherworldly. They were tall, probably 6 or 7 feet, and they were insanely thin and lanky. They were so pale, and they stared right back with those intense orange eyes from before. I just looked back, feeling less afraid but more curious. A few seconds later, James screamed at me. I shook off my confusion and raced toward his place. I jumped inside and bolted the door, all while his drunk uncle swore at us for making too much noise. I looked out of the windows with my gun in hand, but I did not see a thing. There was nothing but fresh tracks. I pulled the curtains back and we heard the strangest noise ever. It sounded like a dog's howl, but it repeated in pulses like it was coming from a Siamang gibbon, using different pitches and tones. The uncle looked like he instantly sobered up after hearing it. He started locking all the doors and windows in the house. To our surprise, all of James's dogs were back, but they were very frightened and confused, cowering in a corner. We watched through the windows. We stayed up for almost the entire night until I eventually needed to fall asleep. We never had any other problems since that night. Whatever these things were, they were fast, smart, and new to me. It looked like some strange dogman, straight from tribal legend. I am not a superstitious type of guy, but I hope it was somehow just a dream, even if my friend and his uncle recall it.
In the summer of 2006, I was offered a place to study history at Bangor University in North Wales. It wasn't my first choice of uni, but I always wanted to move away for university. I mean, that's half the point of the whole thing, isn't it? See, new places, meet new people, expand and enrich your intellect and all that. Bangor wasn't exactly Manchester or Birmingham, but there was something very quaint about having such a relatively prestigious university built into such a small and storied town. In the end, I only lived in Bangor for the better part of a year, as I ended up dropping out due to family problems. But my brief time there yielded a variety of different experiences. Some I'll always remember, and some I wish I could forget. So much like most other students at that age, university bred a desire for, well, experimentation. And as I partook in a few puffs of the wise man's mint, as one of my mates called it, and decided that, yeah, it was something I was going to get into. I didn't take the drinking all that much, too much puking, and the hangovers just weren't worth it. But smoking up in a circle packed with intelligent, thoughtful people, that was a different kettle of fish entirely. Alright, most of the stuff we talked about was just absolute nonsense, which prompted nothing but a descent into giggles. But it was fun. And on top of that, you weren't a soulless, dehydrated husk the next morning. So one morning, I get talking to this local lad called Ricky. Ricky had grown up in Bangor, but wasn't academic enough for university. However, that didn't stop him from walking up into the student areas to take advantage of the public price pubs, which is how I got to talking to him. Eventually,
The conversation got on to smoke and where I could get my hands on some, but local dealers didn't always trust the students, and even when they did, the chances that they just rip you off. Assuming you were spending mommy and daddy's money was very high indeed, which is why Ricky's promise of "I'll get some for you" was like music to my ears. I took his number down, told him I'd give him the text sometime, then finished up my pint, lost my game of pool, then wandered back to Hall's. The next day, I gave Ricky a text, and we arranged to meet outside a block of flats on the other side of town. This seemed a bit risky, as it was in the lower portion of Bangor, where the locals lived, and not up on the hill where most of the lecture rooms and halls were. But Ricky seemed like a nice enough bloke. I considered myself fairly streetwise, and with me having no other connections, I figured, why not? So I went to meet him, gave him my last 20 quid, and stood outside the flats and we went out to ring one of the buzzers. Now, I'm not completely soft, so I actually ended up peering over my shoulder to get a peek of which one he's ringing, just in case anything goes awry. The door opens. He says, "Back in a minute," and walks inside. A minute goes by, no sign of Ricky. 2 minutes go by, still no sign of Ricky. After 15 minutes of standing outside those flats like an absolute plant pot, I tried calling him, but as you can probably guess, he didn't answer his phone. I dropped him a few texts like "WTF is going on in here?" And again, I get no replies. Obviously, I'm absolutely furious, thinking, I can't believe I'm actually getting mugged off here, and there's absolutely no effing chance that I'm about to just walk away without kicking off. So I marched up to the little keypad near the front door of the flats and started buzzing the same button Ricky pushed. "Hello?" Some voice buzzes over the intercom. "Yeah, I'm a mate of Ricky's. He's got something that's mine. He needs to get back." Oh, the fellow on the other end was obviously playing dumb. "Look, mate, I've just seen him go into your flat, so you can either let me in, or I'll come back later with my cousins and we can see what happens." It was a pure bluff. My cousins were like 60 miles away, but it worked. There was a brief silence, and then the door buzzed open. I walked right up the stairs to flat 3, knock on the door, and someone instantly answers it aloud about my age, who's keeping the door closed over because Ricky is evidently hiding inside. "Mate, I know Ricky is here, and he's got something in mind." "So he was here, yeah," the lad cuts me off, "but he's just gone off the back. Said he'll be back in a few minutes." Then I hear a voice that obviously belongs to someone older, saying, "Let him wait inside if he wants." The lad looks off to the right, then opens up the door. I walk in to see about 3 or 4 guys, again about my age, and one older balding bloke are down to his shoulders with this big, thick stash. In front of him on this dirty wooden coffee table, almost every kind of illegal substance you can imagine. And after waiting there for about 15 minutes, tension rising the whole time, I decided to give them something of an ultimatum. Because there's absolutely no doubt that I am getting scammed, and they just so happen to be in on it. Now, I know, what I did next was just stupid. But please don't underestimate how angry I was, and how I just refused to swallow my pride and walk away. So we turned to the old bloke and say something like, "Look man, let's just work this out. Ricky got 20 quid of mine, and I'm not stupid. I know what the crack is. I'm also not walking away without it. So let's just say you give me 1/8 of that green there, and that way, I don't have to file a police report saying some lad robbed me and ran into this flat. You get me?" Big mistake. Massive mistake. Sometimes, it really is just better to swallow your pride and walk away, especially if the only other option is throwing around threats that you're unlikely to back up. But in the heat of the moment, that's kind of what I did. And by kind of, Mo, you'll see what I mean in a minute. until hearing my police threat, the older bloke just sort of nods his up to say fair shout and gets up and walks over to the front door. I'm thinking, hang on, what's he doing? And when he locks the front door to the flat with a mortised lock and slides the key into his pocket, I just think, oh, you can imagine what came next. The 3 younger lads jumped me. I tried my best to fight back, but as you can probably guess, 3-on-1 didn't give me a chance to throw, so much as 2 or 3 solid punches. Before I was on the deck getting the absolute life kicked out of me, all to a soundtrack of you coming to my flat and threatening me. Not happening. But the worst part was when I just heard, grab his hand, kept them still. I'm still in the middle of struggling, but I managed to get just a glimpse of the old bloke with a dumbbell in his hand might know what's coming. This fellow is going to smash my hand to bits without weight, and I'm probably never going to be able to write or type properly again. Thankfully, he didn't go through a smash in my hand up. Instead, he does this feint thing right as I think he's going to do it, then laughs his head off when I let out this embarrassingly girly scream. After that, I'm quite literally thrown out of the flat, and as I manage to bring myself to my feet and look back to see that one of the lads has my bloody provisional driver's license in hand. The wallet must have fallen out of the swipe during the kicking. Ah well, now we know your name and where you live. Go the filth and you're a dead man. Get lost. I wandered. But the story doesn't end there. It just gets much weirder and arguably more terrifying. If I'd have just walked away with a bit of a bruised ego, I'd have saved myself a good kicking. However, in actually laying hands on me, these lads had made a huge mistake. I wasn't some gangster bound to a code of silence and honesty. Neither were they. I was a big city, and I definitely wasn't scared of some small town dealers. And if they thought they could just intimidate some kid into silence, that were dead wrong. Because the first place I go, after I ended up getting kicked out of the Phyllis flat, is the Bangor police station. I was just dead honest with them. I told them I got scammed trying to buy smoke. Told the man being battered with me thinking the whole time, they're going to go round up this bloke's flat, and they're going to know he's got drugs in there. The place stunk of them, and that's how I'm going to get my own back. Solid plan, right? And quick side note, for anyone who says I'm a coward, a grass, or a snitch for going to the police, wind your neck in Tony, Montana. This isn't The Wire. This is real life, and you fight with anything you've got available to you. Only, it didn't quite turn out like that. I was hoping the police would knock round Nick the bloke and his underlings, and then I'd see massive drug busts in the papers for a week or something like that. But when the police got back in touch, they said they'd nick a lad for assaulting me, but he was going to plead guilty, so it didn't look like I'd have to go to court or anything. They gave me some leaflets on getting over trauma, advised me to file victims of crime compensation claim, and then that was that. Yeah, it was some small measure of revenge, but it wasn't quite the complete and utter takedown I'd been hoping for. That being said, it would turn out that I didn't have to lift a finger to get my own back on Ricky. His own people would do that for me. Not even 7 days later, I'm doing a bit of food shopping down at Morson's, when who should I see? The giant cast on his leg and bruises all over his face. But Ricky, of all people, almost everyone I spoke to about it was like, wow, that's some karma in action right there. And they might still be right. It might have been a complete coincidence that 1 week the lad robs me, and the next he's in a bloody thigh cast, which, how I know it, must have been a really bad break. Stranger things have happened, right? But there's a thing. I don't really believe in coincidences. I believe in cause and effect. I think the top dog down in the lower town flat was just that top dog in the area. And I think the trouble Ricky ended up causing him Monday was only a fanny hair away from being nicked for selling Class A's. I think he was so angry that he had his little minions break Ricky's leg. I mean, how else to explain his black eyes and all that? He slipped and fell on the path of an oncoming fun run, pulled the other one. But then, the thing that really tickled me, the thing that honestly made my blood run cold, was this. If they were willing to do that to one of their own, they wouldn't bat an eyelid at the idea of doing the same to some other idiot student, would they? And it's only then that I realized how bloody lucky I'd really been. A few months after I completely balls up my end-of-year exams, ended up dropping out. And that was the end of that chapter. Needless to say, despite the relatively short amount of time I'd spent there, Bangor really did teach me a thing or two. They just turned out not quite to be the kind of things I imagined when I arrived.
I am now a 72-year-old man. This happened long ago, but I remember it so well. The background was a series of events that placed me in a mountain cabin outside of Frederick, Maryland, circa 1969 or 1970. I had dropped out of college. My father had died very badly, and I was alienated. I needed to get my mind right. The opportunity to move to an isolated cabin to live in contemplation and solitude was welcome. To the best of my memory, I was there 8 to 9 months. No TV, but books and radio. I had a library card, and I can't remember if I even had a phone. The story begins when a month into my stay, a female beagle showed up at my door. She was a lost dog, and I took her in. Never could train her to do anything, but I fed her, and she was a sweet, if not the brightest dog. A few months in, I began to feel a presence around the isolated cabin. Hard to describe, but I felt like someone was watching, on many occasions. I thought someone might even be looking into my cabin window, watching us. The next phase was the shadowing or following. I knew the folks a half-mile down the lane woods, all around, and would sometimes visit them at night. Someone, something, was waiting for me and followed closely in the woods. You could hear it easily footsteps in the woods, and it picked up its pace as I did. This not only happened to me, but to my younger brother who visited, and to friends, and it spooked them. At night, it was out there around the cabin. And here's the funny thing. I was never afraid, never felt threatened. Not at all, at least early on. There was no feeling of malevolence. I spent a good bit of time wandering the vast areas of woodlands around me. There was a state park just up the hill, and the Frederick Municipal Forest went on for mile after mile. The whole of western Maryland was much more country than it is now. None of the development had set in yet. In our hikes, the dog and I, we came across evidence of campsites, recent ones in the woods. There were traces of fires, old abandoned buildings that had corners that gave shelter and looked slept in, garbage, food and drink, perhaps hunters, but much of it did not have the organized feel that you would get from experienced hunters. The last month of my stay there was when things intensified. Maybe he sensed I was preparing to leave. In the mornings, I would find small, dead animals at the bottom of the front porch steps. The cabin had a small front porch screened with a light door and 4 wooden steps to the ground. A spotlight would illuminate the long front yard with woods close by on either side. Dead animals began to appear at the bottom of the steps many mornings. I remember small birds, then a squirrel, a rabbit, even a weasel one day like they were offerings. I had to grab them up before the dog ate them, and this went on almost daily for several weeks. One night very late, I was awoken by some sound. I lay in bed and heard something from the front porch. I hopped up and hit the lights. I saw that hound dog who never learned to sit or stay standing at the front door in a perfect pointer position. She was shaking in fear. She never barked. I heard the door slam and footsteps down the steps. I hit the spotlight but saw nothing. I went out. He had been on the porch at my front door, maybe trying to enter. After that, I stayed in at night more and more. The animal offerings got bigger and bigger, larger birds, an opossum, a woodchuck. It really wasn't funny. The final 2 gifts were legs either from horses or even cows. Big and bloody. One was skinned. Dear God. And the second to last day, the dog left me. I could hear her in the woods howling on a trail following a scent. I looked for her in every way I could, came up in the following weeks, but to no avail. She left as she came. I moved back to Maryland's suburbs of D.C., got an apartment with a friend, got a job and moved on with my life. One day not long after, I picked up the Washington Post, and there was an article about recent encounters with the Sykesville monster. It's described as a tall, Yeti-like creature, fur covered on 2 legs that would pick out a family or person and give them attention. I wasn't the only one. That attention described in the article was exactly what had happened to me, following you at night. Looking inside the house, gifts, and so on. I was shocked. If I had turned on that spotlight and seen a Bigfoot or Yeti, I might still be running, but I think I know who it was. Sykesville, Maryland was the location of the Springfield Hospital Center, a large state psychiatric hospital. It was 20 miles or so east of Frederick, and back then, many folks knew how to live in the woods. They grew up that way, country folks. I think the monster was actually an escaped patient or just a free schizophrenic who lived outside. This is like all the homeless you see in the cities now. Probably off his meds, but somehow functional and just lonely. He would pick people or families to adopt, so to speak. The camps in the woods could have been him. Nothing to do. He would make mischief. I think he liked me, but sensed that I was leaving. Now I can't prove any of this. It's just my theory. My monster was very much of that time and place, and his behavior was what I noticed in nearly every case then. I don't think he could have survived until the 1980s. Deinstitutionalization of mental hospitals threw the mentally ill out into the streets and took away the shelter of hospitals, unprotected. The mentally ill do die, but once in a while they find their way to you. Even now, as an old man, I look back at those mountain woods and realize that for a brief moment in time, I wasn't nearly as alone as I thought I was. Even if my companion was someone the rest of the world had forgotten or feared. The town I lived in has developed a massive amount since the time of this story. When this happened, there were many factories spread out across the landscape with vast, empty stretches of land sitting between them. A Walmart was being built in the area at the time, but the project had barely started and was mostly just a skeleton of construction. While a main highway ran through the center of town, my mother generally avoided it. The traffic was consistently heavy and frustrating. Instead, we would travel along the side streets, which were incredibly desolate and lacked any significant street lighting. These roads were so quiet and isolated that it was rare to see another car. I cannot quite remember where we were coming from on that particular evening, but I was in the car with my mother and my younger brother, who is 3 years younger than me. My mother was behind the wheel. I was sitting in the front passenger seat, and my brother was buckled in directly behind me. My mother is truly the sweetest person I know, but she has always been very adamant about a specific safety rule. She would never stop to help a person on the side of the road or pick up a stranger, especially when her children were in the vehicle with her. However, she was not heartless. She always called the police. She did this so that professional help could be dispatched to the person in need. It was roughly 9 p.m. as we were making our way home. As we drove, my mother and I both spotted a vehicle. It was on the passenger side of the road with its hood propped up. It seemed like a completely ordinary breakdown, and my mother slowed the car down slightly out of caution. Because it was so dark, she was careful. She did not want to risk accidentally hitting someone who might be leaning over the engine or working on the car. Just as we drew level, a man suddenly stepped out from around the raised hood and moved toward us. He moved toward the street, frantically waving his arms to flag us down. I do not have a very clear memory of what the man looked like because I was not paying much attention at first. The darkness made it difficult to see his features. I do remember feeling a sense of guilt, thinking it was a shame that we were not going to stop and see what he required. The man moved further out. He moved into the middle of the road to continue waving at us, but as we passed, we noticed that there was nobody else inside his car. My mother quickly swerved the car around him to stay on the road. She immediately instructed my brother to search for her phone inside her purse, which was sitting on the floorboard between the front and back seats. When I turned to look at my mother, I saw her checking the mirror. Her face suddenly went completely white and her eyes grew wide with a look of pure terror. Without warning, she slammed her foot down on the accelerator, causing the car to surge forward. This was incredibly out of character. She was usually very careful about sticking to the speed limit. At that moment, I realized something was terribly wrong. Her voice became high-pitched and strained with panic as she repeatedly asked my brother if he had the phone. I began yelling at her to tell me what was happening, and the sheer chaos of the moment began to freak my brother out. Being so young, he started crying and struggled to find the phone in the dark. My mother kept her eyes glued to the road ahead but continued to glance nervously at the mirror, finally stating that the man was following us. I did not fully understand the situation, but the tension was clear. The tension in the car made it clear that we were in danger. My mother began speeding toward the highway, and fortunately, the road was clear of traffic. When I looked out the back window, I saw a car. It was driving aggressively, passing other vehicles in an attempt to keep pace with my mother's car. I asked her where she was taking us, and she explained that she was heading directly to the police station for safety. As we neared our destination, my mother gave us very specific instructions. She told me that the moment she brought the car to a stop, I needed to jump out, grab my brother from the back seat, and run. She planned to meet us on the other side of the car so we could enter the station together. She pulled up right in front of the police station and was so hurried that she shifted into park early. The car had not even come to a full stop. I threw my door open as fast as I could and grabbed my brother, who had already managed to unlatch his own door. I took off in a sprint. I was holding my brother with one hand and my mother with the other as we rushed toward the entrance. Once we were finally inside and speaking with a police officer, I began to understand the full extent. My mother told the officer that as soon as we had passed the man with the broken-down car, he had quickly ran to the front of his vehicle and slammed the hood shut. He then jumped in and sped after us. That was the moment my mother knew that this guy had horrible intentions for us. She described how he kept trying to speed up to get on the side of our car. She was able to increase her speed to avoid that. According to my mother, the man stopped following her the moment she turned toward the police station. She gave the officers the best description she could of the man. However, because everything happened so fast, she did not get a license plate number. I am pretty sure the police never found him. I am also not sure what the guy had planned for us. If we had actually stopped to help, I know that it was nothing good.
Our family lives for the Christmas season. We are exactly the kind of people who start decorating in the middle of November, much to the annoyance of some. We have even turned the first yearly play of Mariah Carey's holiday anthem into a sacred family ritual. My husband and our 3 daughters always dress in matching pajamas, a tradition that never fails to make me smile. Even though the stress of cooking a massive dinner can be overwhelming, I truly love being the heart of the family, the home where all the relatives gather when December arrives. However, there is a significant complication to our festive spirit. We are Australian. To explain for those elsewhere, while Christmas is a winter affair in America and Europe, December in Australia falls during the peak of summer. Down under, you are far more likely to be wearing a Santa hat while sunbathing than you are to be sipping eggnog by a cozy fire. Despite the heat, our holiday imagery is filled with snow-covered landscapes and red-breasted robins perched on pine trees. In Darwin, where we live, we have palm trees instead of pines. My daughters had never actually seen real snow, and by 2019, we decided it was time to change that. We ignored the people who called us crazy and booked flights to Europe for late November. The journey was incredible. While I found the long flights to be a grueling ordeal, seeing Europe's historic landmarks dusted in snow made every cramped hour in the airplane feel worthwhile. Our itinerary took us through Prague, Berlin, Rome, Copenhagen, Paris, and London. Despite the beauty of those cities, my family was most excited about visiting Ireland. The girls had convinced themselves that Ireland was a magical realm, inhabited by fairies, while my husband was equally enthusiastic about the prospect of tasting Guinness straight from the tap. When we arrived in Cork, we checked into a charming Airbnb in the suburbs. It was a semi-detached house that looked like it had been plucked straight from a storybook. Before anyone had even unpacked, the girls were already asking for the internet password. My husband works in IT, and he is very passionate about internet safety. He views it not just as a job, but as a vital way to protect our daughters from the darker corners of the web. Whenever we stay in a new place, he makes it a point to scan the network to ensure everything is secure and that parental locks are active. As I sat drinking a cup of coffee, I watched him working on his laptop and noticed a specific troubled expression on his face that I knew meant he had found something concerning. I sat down next to him on the couch and looked at the screen, though the technical data looked like nonsense to me. I had to ask him to explain what was wrong. He pointed to a specific line of text and explained that a device was already connected to the Wi-Fi when we arrived. He accounted for our own phones and his laptop, but there was one mystery device remaining. He then opened a new window and pointed to an icon that was unmistakably the symbol for a camera. Trying to stay positive, I suggested it might just be an outdoor security camera for the property. My husband decided to walk around the entire building, but he returned saying he couldn't find a device anywhere on the exterior. He went back to his computer to use his technical skills, and a few minutes later, he called me into the kitchen. His voice had that specific dad tone, serious and urgent, but controlled so as not to alert the children that something was wrong. His eyes were wide as he showed me the laptop screen. It displayed a live video feed of the bedroom where our daughters were supposed to sleep. The view was from above, as if the camera were mounted on the ceiling. We immediately ran upstairs to the girls' room to investigate. We discovered the camera hidden inside a smoke detector, located directly over one of the beds. It was a terrifying realization that someone had planned to watch our daughters while they slept. It was easily the creepiest experience our family had ever faced. My husband called the property owner immediately to demand an explanation for the camera in the children's room. At first, the owner claimed there was no CCTV on the property at all. He even had the audacity to suggest that the video feed must be coming from a different house in the neighborhood, which was a ridiculous lie since I could clearly see my own children on the screen. My husband eventually had to threaten to send the owner a screenshot of the live feed before the man would admit the camera was theirs. The owner then tried to excuse it by claiming they were simply trying to protect their investment. My husband didn't buy the excuse and accused the man of being a voyeur, stating that we would be reporting the incident to Airbnb immediately. At that point, the owner became flustered and silent before abruptly hanging up the phone. We had called him out for being a creep, and he had no defense for his actions. We were furious and deeply unsettled, realizing we had only narrowly prevented a stranger from watching our kids all night. Even though it was late, we had the girls pack their bags while we searched for a nearby hotel. It took several months of back and forth emails with Airbnb's customer service, but we eventually received the full refund we deserved. Airbnb also informed us that they had banned the homeowner from the platform. That news provided me with much more peace of mind than the money did. I have always known that people with such dark desires exist, but I never expected to encounter one myself, especially during what was supposed to be a dream vacation. My main concern now is whether Airbnb can truly keep people like that off their site. My husband and I have asked them about the systems they use to ensure guest safety, but their answers have been far from satisfying. We pointed out that a person like that could easily create a new account using a friend's or relative's name to continue recording children without anyone knowing. The legalistic response we received essentially admitted they had no real solution for that possibility. That is the fear that stays with me. I worry that somewhere else, a child is sleeping peacefully while a stranger watches them, and there is nothing being done to stop it.